Chapter 7. Forgetting of Impressions and Resolutions. If anyone should be inclined to overrate the state of our present knowledge of mental life, all that would be needed to force him to assume a modest attitude would be to remind him of the function of memory. No psychologic theory has yet been able to account for the connection between the fundamental phenomena of remembering and forgetting. Indeed, even the complete analysis of that which one can actually observe has as yet scarcely been grasped. Today, forgetting has perhaps grown more puzzling than remembering, especially since we have learned from the study of dreams and pathologic states that even what for a long time we believed forgotten may suddenly return to consciousness. To be sure, we are in possession of some viewpoints which we hope will receive general recognition. Thus we assume that forgetting is a spontaneous process to which we may ascribe a certain temporal discharge. We emphasize the fact that just as among the units of every impression of experience, in forgetting too a certain selection takes place among the existing impressions. We are acquainted with some of the conditions that underlie the tenaciousness of memory and the awakening of that which would otherwise remain forgotten. Nevertheless, we can observe in innumerable cases of daily life how unreliable and unsatisfactory our knowledge of the mechanism is. Thus we may listen to two persons exchanging reminiscences concerning the same outward impressions, say of a journey that they have taken together some time before. What remains most firmly in the memory of the one is often forgotten by the other, as if it had never occurred, even when there is not the slightest reason to assume that this impression is of greater psychic importance for one than for the other. A great many of those factors which determine the selective power of memory are obviously still beyond our ken. With the purpose of adding some small contribution to the knowledge of the conditions of forgetting, I was wont to subject to a psychologic analysis those cases in which forgetting concerned me personally. As a rule, I took up only a certain group of those cases, namely, those in which the forgetting astonished me, because in my opinion I should have remembered the experience in question. I wish further to remark that I am generally not inclined to forgetfulness, of things experienced, not of things learned, and that for a short period of my youth I was able to perform extraordinary feats of memory. When I was a schoolboy, it was quite natural for me to be able to repeat from memory the page of a book which I had read, and shortly before I entered the university I could write down practically verbatim the popular lectures on scientific subjects directly after hearing them. In the tension before the final medical examination, I must have made use of the remnant of this ability, for in certain subjects I gave the examiners apparently automatic answers, which proved to be exact reproductions of the textbook, which I had skimmed through but once, and then in greatest haste. Since those days I have steadily lost control over my memory. Of late, however, I became convinced that with the aid of a certain artifice I can recall far more than I would otherwise credit myself with remembering. For example, when during my office hours a patient states that I have seen him before, and I cannot recall either the fact or the time, then I help myself by guessing. That is, I allow a number of years, beginning from the present time, to come to mind quickly. Whenever this could be controlled by records of definite information from the patient, it was always shown that in over 10 years I have seldom missed by more than 6 months. The same thing happens when I meet a casual acquaintance, and from politeness inquire about his small child. When he tells of its progress, I try to fancy how old the child now is. I control my estimate by the information given by the father, and at most I make a mistake of a month, and in older children of 3 months. I cannot state, however, what basis I have for this estimate. Of late I have grown so bold that I always offer my estimate spontaneously, and still run no risk of grieving the father by displaying my ignorance in regard to his offspring. Thus I extend my conscious memory by invoking my larger unconscious memory. I shall report some striking examples of forgetting, which for the most part I have observed in myself. I distinguish forgetting of impressions and experiences, that is, the forgetting of knowledge, from forgetting of resolutions, that is, the forgetting of omissions. The uniform result of the entire series of observations I can formulate as follows: the forgetting in all cases is proved to be founded on a motive of displeasure. Forgetting of impressions and knowledge. A. During the summer my wife once made me very angry, although the cause in itself was trifling. We sat in a restaurant opposite a gentleman from Vienna whom I knew, and who had cause to know me, and whose acquaintance I had reasons for not wishing to renew. My wife, who had heard nothing to the disrepute of the man opposite her, showed by her actions that she was listening to his conversation with his neighbors, for from time to time she asked me questions which took up the thread of their discussion. I became impatient and finally irritated. A few weeks later I complained to a relative about this behavior on the part of my wife, but I was not able to recall even a single word of the conversation of the gentleman in the case. I am usually rather resentful, and cannot forget a single incident of an episode that has annoyed me. My amnesia in this case was undoubtedly determined by respect for my wife. A short time ago I had a similar experience. I wished to make merry with an intimate friend over a statement made by my wife only a few hours earlier, but I found myself hindered by the noteworthy fact that I had entirely forgotten the statement. I had first to beg my wife to recall it to me. It is easy to understand that my forgetting in this case may be analogous to the typical disturbance of judgment which dominates us when it concerns those nearest to us. B. To oblige a woman who was a stranger in Vienna, I had undertaken to procure a small iron safe for the preservation of documents and money. When I offered my services, the image of an establishment in the heart of the city where I was sure I had seen such safes floated before me with extraordinary visual vividness. To be sure, I could not recall the name of the street, but I felt certain that I would discover the store in a walk through the city, for my memory told me that I had passed it countless times. To my chagrin, I could not find this establishment with the safes, though I walked through the inner part of the city in every direction. I concluded that the only thing left to do was to search through a business directory, and if that failed, to try to identify the establishment in a second round of the city. It did not, however, require so much effort. Among the addresses in the directory, I found one which immediately presented itself as that which had been forgotten. It was true that I had passed the show window countless times. Each time, however, when I had gone to visit the M family, who had lived a great many years in this identical building. After this intimate friendship had turned to an absolute estrangement, I had taken care to avoid the neighborhood as well as the house, though without ever thinking of the reason for my action. In my walk through the city, searching for the safe in the show window, I had traversed every street in the neighborhood but the right one, and I had avoided this as if it were forbidden ground. The motive of displeasure, which was at the bottom of my disorientation, is thus comprehensible. But the mechanism of forgetting is no longer so simple as in the former example. Here my aversion naturally does not extend to the vendor of safes, but to another person, concerning whom I wish to know nothing, and later transfers itself from the latter to this incident, where it brings about the forgetting. Similarly, in the case of Burckhardt mentioned above, the grudge against the one brought about the error in writing the name of the other. The similarity of names, which here established a connection between two essentially different streams of thought, was accomplished in the showcase window instance by the contiguity of space and the inseparable environment. Moreover, this latter case was more closely knit together, for money played a great part in the causation of the estrangement from the family living in this house. C. The B&R Company requested me to pay a professional call on one of their officers. On my way to him I was engrossed in the thought that I must already have been in the building occupied by the firm. It seemed as if I used to see their signboard in a lower story, while my professional visit was taking me to a higher story. I could not recall, however, which house it was, nor when I had called there. Although the entire matter was indifferent and of no consequence, I nevertheless occupied myself with it, and at last learned in the usual roundabout way, by collecting the thoughts that occurred to me in this connection, that one story above the floor occupied by the firm B&R was the pension fissure, where I had frequently visited patients. Then I remembered the building which sheltered both company and the pension. I was still puzzled, however, as to the motive that entered into play in this forgetting. I found nothing disagreeable in my memory concerning the firm itself, or the pension fissure, or the patients living there. I was also aware that it could not deal with anything very painful, otherwise I hardly would have been successful in tracing the thing forgotten in a roundabout way, without resorting to external aid, as happened in the preceding example. Finally, it occurred to me that a little before, while starting on my way to a new patient, a gentleman whom I had difficulty in recalling greeted me in the street. Some months previously I had seen this man in an apparently serious condition, and had made the diagnosis of general paresis, but later I had learned of his recovery, consequently my judgment had been incorrect. Was it not possible that we had in this case a remission, which one usually finds in dementia paralytica? In that contingency my diagnosis would still be justified. The influence emanating from this meeting caused me to forget the neighborhood of the B&R Company, and my interest to discover the thing forgotten was transferred from this case of disputed diagnosis. But the associative connection in this loose inner relation was effected by means of a similarity of names. The man who recovered, contrary to expectation, was also an officer of a large company that recommends patients to me, and the physician with whom I had seen the supposed paretic bore the name of Fisher, the name of the pension in the house which I had forgotten. D. Mislaying a thing really has the same significance as forgetting where we have placed it. Like most people delving in pamphlets and books, I am well oriented about my desk, and can produce what I want with one lunge. What appears to others as disorder has become for me perfect order. Why then did I mislay a catalogue which was sent to me not long ago, so that it could not be found? What is more, it had been my intention to order a book which I found announced therein, entitled Über die Sprache, because it was written by an author whose spirited, vivacious style I liked, whose insight into psychology and whose knowledge of the cultural world I had learned to appreciate. I believe that was just why I mislaid the catalogue. It was my habit to lend the books of this author among my friends for their enlightenment, and a few days before, on returning one, somebody had said, "His style reminds me altogether of yours, and his way of thinking is identical." The speaker did not know what he was stirring up with his remark. Years ago, when I was younger and in greater need of forming alliances, I was told practically the same thing by an older colleague, to whom I had recommended the writings of a familiar medical author. To put it in his words, "It is absolutely your style and manner." I was so influenced by these remarks that I wrote a letter to this author with the object of bringing about a closer relation, but a rather cool answer put me back in my place. Perhaps still earlier discouraging experiences conceal themselves behind this last one, for I did not find the mislaid catalogue. Through this premonition I was actually prevented from ordering the advertised book, although the disappearance of the catalogue formed no real hindrance, as I remembered well both the name of the book and the author. E. Another case of mislaying merits our attention on account of the conditions under which the mislaid object was rediscovered. A younger man narrates as follows. Several years ago there were some misunderstandings between me and my wife. I found her too cold, and though I fully appreciated her excellent qualities, we lived together without evincing any tenderness for each other. One day, on her return from a walk, she gave me a book which she had bought because she thought it would interest me. I thanked her for this mark of attention, promised to read the book, put it away, and did not find it again. So months passed, during which I occasionally remembered the lost book, and also tried in vain to find it. About 6 months later, my beloved mother, who was not living with us, became ill. My wife left home to nurse her mother-in-law. The patient's condition became serious, and gave my wife the opportunity to show the best side of herself. One evening I returned home full of enthusiasm over what my wife had accomplished, and felt very grateful to her. I stepped to my desk, and without definite intention, but with the certainty of a somnambulist, I opened a certain drawer, and in the very top of it I found the long missing, mislaid book. The following example of misplacing belongs to a type well known to every psychoanalyst. I must add that the patient who experienced this misplacing has himself found the solution of it. This patient, whose psychoanalytic treatment had to be interrupted through the summer vacation, when he was in a state of resistance and ill health, put away his keys in the evening in their usual place, or so he thought. He then remembered that he wished to take some things from his desk, where he also had put the money which he needed on the journey. He was to part the next day, which was the last day of treatment, and the date when the doctor's fee was due, but the keys had disappeared. He began a thorough and systematic search through his small apartment. He became more and more excited over it, but his search was unsuccessful. As he recognized this misplacement as a symptomatic act, that is, as being intentional, he aroused his servant in order to continue his search with the help of an unprejudiced person. After another hour he gave up the search, and feared he had lost the keys. The next morning he ordered new keys from the desk factory, which were hurriedly made for him. Two acquaintances who had been with him in a cab even recalled hearing something fall to the ground as he stepped out of the cab, and he was therefore convinced that the keys had slipped from his pocket. They were found lying between a thick book and a thin pamphlet, the latter a work of one of my pupils, which he wished to take along as reading matter for his vacation. They were so skilfully placed that no one would have supposed that they were there. He himself was unable to replace the keys in such a position as to render them invisible. The unconscious skill with which an object is misplaced on account of secret but strong motives reminds one of somnambulistic sureness. The motive was naturally ill humor over the interruption of the treatment, and the secret rage over the fact that he had to pay such a high fee when he felt so ill. G. Brill relates, a man was urged by his wife to attend a social function in which he really took no interest. Yielding to his wife's entreaties, he began to take his dress suit from the trunk, when he suddenly thought of shaving. After accomplishing this, he returned to the trunk and found it locked. Despite a long, earnest search, the key could not be found. A locksmith could not be found on Sunday evening, so that the couple had to send their regrets. On having the trunk opened the next morning, the lost key was found within. The husband had absent-mindedly dropped the key into the trunk and sprung the lock. He assured me that this was wholly unintentional and unconscious, but we know that he did not wish to go to this social affair. The mislaying of the key, therefore, lacked no motive." End quote. Ernst Jones noticed in himself that he was in the habit of mislaying his pipe whenever he suffered from the effects of over-smoking. The pipe was then found in some unusual place where it did not belong, and which it normally did not occupy. If one looks over the cases of mislaying, it will be difficult to assume that mislaying is anything other than the result of an unconscious intention. In the summer of 1901, I once remarked to a friend with whom I was then actively engaged in exchanging ideas on scientific questions, "These neurotic problems can be solved only if we take the position of absolutely accepting an original bisexuality in every individual." To which he replied, "I told you that 2½ years ago, while we were taking an evening walk. At the time you wouldn't listen to it." It is truly painful to be thus requested to renounce one's originality. I could neither recall such a conversation nor my friend's revelation. One of us must be mistaken, and according to the principle of the question, cui prodest, I must be the one. Indeed, in the course of the following week, everything came back to me just as my friend had recalled it. I myself remembered that at that time I gave the answer I have not got so far, and I do not care to discuss it. But since this incident I have grown more tolerant when I miss any mention of my name in medical literature in connection with ideas for which I deserve credit. It is scarcely accidental that the numerous examples of forgetting which have been collected without any selection should require for their solution the introduction of such painful themes as exposing one's wife, a friendship that has turned into the opposite, a mistake in medical diagnosis, enmity on account of similar pursuits, or the borrowing of somebody's ideas. I am rather inclined to believe that every person who will undertake an inquiry into the motives underlying his forgetting will be able to fill up a similar sample card of vexatious circumstances. The tendency to forget the disagreeable seems to me to be quite general. The capacity for it is naturally differently developed in different persons. Certain denials which we encounter in medical practice can probably be ascribed to forgetting. Our conception of such forgetting confines the distinction between this and that behavior to purely psychologic relations, and permits us to see in both forms of reaction the expression of the same motive. Of the numerous examples of denials of unpleasant recollection which I have observed in kinsmen of patients, one remains in my memory as especially singular. A mother, telling me of the childhood of her nervous son, now in his puberty, made the statement that, like his brothers and sisters, he was subject to bedwetting throughout his childhood, a symptom which certainly has some significance in the history of a neurotic patient. Some weeks later, while seeking information regarding the treatment, I had occasion to call her attention to signs of a constitutional morbid predisposition in the young man, and at the same time referred to the bedwetting recounted in the anamnesis. To my surprise, she contested this fact concerning him, denying it as well for the other children, and asked me how I could possibly know this. Finally, I let her know that she herself had told me a short time before what she had thus forgotten. One also finds abundant indications which show that even in healthy, not neurotic persons, resistances are found against the memory of disagreeable impressions and the idea of painful thoughts. But the full significance of this fact can be estimated only when we enter into the psychology of neurotic persons. One is forced to make such elementary defensive striving against ideas which can awaken painful feelings, a striving which can be put side by side only with the flight reflex in painful stimuli, as the main pillar of the mechanism which carries the hysterical symptoms. One need not offer any objection to the acceptance of such defensive tendency, on the ground that we frequently find it impossible to rid ourselves of painful memories which cling to us, or to banish such painful emotions as remorse and reproaches of conscience. No one maintains that this defensive tendency invariably gains the upper hand, that in the play of psychic forces it may not strike against factors which stir up the contrary feeling for other purposes, and bring it about in spite of it. As the architectural principle of the psychic apparatus, we may conjecture a certain stratification or structure of instances deposited in strata, and it is quite possible that this defense tendency belongs to a lower psychic instance, and is inhibited by higher instances. At all events, it speaks for the existence and force of this defensive tendency, when we can trace it to processes such as those found in our examples of forgetting. We see, then, that something is forgotten for its own sake, and where it is not possible, the defensive tendency misses the target and causes something else to be forgotten, something less significant, but which has fallen into associative connection with the disagreeable material. The views here developed, namely, that painful memories merge into motivated forgetting with special ease, merits application in many spheres where as yet it has found no, or scarcely any, recognition. Thus it seems to me that it has not been strongly enough emphasized in the estimation of testimony taken in court, where the putting of a witness under oath obviously leads us to place too great a trust in the purifying influence of his psychic play of forces. It is universally admitted that in the origin of the traditions and folklore of a people, care must be taken to eliminate from memory such a motive as would be painful to the national feeling. Perhaps, on closer investigation, it may be possible to form a perfect analogy between the manner of development of national traditions and infantile reminiscences of the individual. The great Darwin has formulated a golden rule for the scientific worker from his insight into his pain motive of forgetting. Almost exactly as in the forgetting of names, faulty recollections can also appear in the forgetting of impressions, and when finding credence they may be designated as delusions of memory. The memory disturbance in pathological cases, in paranoia it actually plays the role of a constituting factor in the formation of delusions, has brought to light an extensive literature in which there is no reference whatever to its being motivated. As this theme also belongs to the psychology of the neuroses, it goes beyond our present treatment. Instead, I will give from my own experience a curious example of memory disturbance, showing clear enough its determination through unconscious repressed material, and its connection with this material. While writing the latter chapters of my volume on the interpretation of dreams, I happened to be in a summer resort without access to libraries and reference books, so that I was compelled to introduce into the manuscript all kinds of references and citations from memory. These I naturally reserved for future correction. In the chapter on daydreams, I thought of the distinguished figure of the poor bookkeeper in Alphonse Daudet's Nabob, through whom the author probably described his own daydreams. I imagine that I distinctly remembered one fantasy of this man, whom I called Mr. Jocelyn, which he hatched while walking the streets of Paris, and I began to reproduce it from my memory. This fantasy described how Mr. Jocelyn boldly hurled himself at a runaway horse, and brought it to a standstill; how the carriage door opened, and a great personage stepped from the coupe, pressed Mr. Jocelyn's hand, and said, "You are my saviour. I owe you my life. What can I do for you?" I assured myself that casual inaccuracies in the rendition of this fantasy could readily be corrected at home on consulting the book. But when I perused Nabob in order to compare it with my manuscript, I found, to my very great shame and consternation, that there was nothing to suggest such a dream by Mr. Jocelyn. Indeed, the poor bookkeeper did not even bear this name. He was called Mr. Joyeuse. This second error, then, furnished the key for the solution of the first mistake, the faulty reminiscence. Joyeux, of which joyeuse is the feminine form, was the only possible word which would translate my own name Freud into French. Whence, therefore, came this falsely remembered fantasy which I had attributed to Daudet? It could only be a product of my own daydream which I myself had spun, and which did not become conscious, or which was once conscious and had been absolutely forgotten. Perhaps I invented it myself in Paris, where frequently enough I walked the streets alone, and full of longing for a helper and protector, until Charcot took me into his circle. I had often met the author of Nabob in Charcot's house. But the provoking part of it all is the fact that there is scarcely anything to which I am so hostile as the thought of being someone's protégé. What we see of this sort of thing in our country spoils all desire for it, and my character is little suited to the rôle of a protected child. I have always entertained an immense desire to be the strong man myself, and it had to happen that I should be reminded of such a, to be sure, never fulfilled daydream. Besides, this incident is a good example of how the restraint relation to one's ego, which breaks forth triumphantly in paranoia, disturbs and entangles us in the objective grasp of things. Another case of faulty recollection, which can be satisfactorily explained, resembles the fausse reconnaissance to be discussed later. I related to one of my patients, an ambitious and very capable man, that a young student had recently gained admittance into the circle of my pupils by means of an interesting work, Der Künstler versus eine Sexualpsychologie. When a year and a quarter later this work lay before me in print, my patient maintained that he remembered with certainly having read somewhere, perhaps in a bookseller's advertisement, the announcement of the same book even before I first mentioned it to him. He remembered that this announcement came to his mind at that time, and he ascertained besides that the author had changed the title, that it no longer read Versuch, but Ansatze zu einer Sexualpsychologie. Careful inquiry of the author and comparison of all dates show conclusively that my patient was trying to recall the impossible. No notice of this work had appeared anywhere before its publication, certainly not a year and a quarter before it went to print. However, I neglected to seek a solution for this false recollection until the same man brought about an equally valuable renewal of it. He thought that he had recently noticed a work on agoraphobia in the show window of a bookshop, and as he was now looking for it in all available catalogues, I was able to explain to him why his effort must remain fruitless. The work on agoraphobia existed only in his fantasy as an unconscious resolution to write such a book himself. His ambition to emulate that young man, and through such a scientific work to become one of my pupils, had led him to the first as well as to the second false recollection. He also recalled later that the bookseller's announcement which had occasioned his false reminiscence dealt with a work entitled Genesis das Gesetz der Zeugung, Genesis, the Law of Generation. But the change in the title, as mentioned by him, was really instigated by me. I recalled that I myself had perpetrated the same inaccuracy in the repetition of the title by saying Ansatze in place of Versuch. Forgetting of intentions. No other group of phenomena is better qualified to demonstrate the thesis that lack of attention does not in itself suffice to explain faulty acts as the forgetting of intentions. An intention is an impulse for an action which has already found approbation, but whose execution is postponed for a suitable occasion. Now, in the interval thus created, sufficient change may take place in the motive to prevent the intention from coming to execution. It is not, however, forgotten; it is simply revised and omitted. We are naturally not in the habit of explaining the forgetting of intentions which we daily experience in every possible situation, as being due to a recent change in the adjustment of motives. We generally leave it unexplained, or we seek a psychologic explanation in the assumption that at the time of execution the required attention for the action, which was an indispensable condition for the occurrence of the intention, and was then at the disposal of the same action, no longer exists. Observation of our normal behavior towards intentions urges us to reject this tentative explanation as arbitrary. If I resolve in the morning to carry out a certain intention in the evening, I may be reminded of it several times in the course of the day, but it is not at all necessary that it should become conscious throughout the day. As the time for its execution approaches, it suddenly occurs to me and induces me to take the necessary preparation for the intended action. If I go walking and take a letter with me to be posted, it is not at all necessary that I, as a normal, not nervous individual, should carry it in my hand and continually look for a letter box. As a matter of fact, I am accustomed to put it in my pocket and give my thoughts free rein on my way, feeling confident that the first letter box will attract my attention and cause me to put my hand in my pocket and draw out the letter. This normal behavior in a formed intention corresponds perfectly with the experimentally produced conduct of persons who are under a so-called post-hypnotic suggestion to perform something after a certain time. We are accustomed to describe the phenomenon in the following manner. The suggested intention slumbers in the person concerned until the time for its execution approaches. Then it awakes and excites the action. In two positions of life, even the layman is cognizant of the fact that forgetting, referring to intended purposes, can in no wise claim consideration as an elementary phenomenon no further reducible, but realizes that it ultimately depends on unadmitted motives. I refer to affairs of love and military service. A lover who is late at the appointment place will vainly tell his sweetheart that unfortunately he has entirely forgotten their rendezvous. She will not hesitate to answer him, "A year ago you would not have forgotten. Evidently you no longer care for me." Even if she should grasp the above cited psychologic explanation, and should wish to excuse his forgetting on the plea of important business, he would only elicit the answer from the woman, who has become as keen-sighted as the physician in the psychoanalytic treatment: "How remarkable that such business disturbances did not occur before." Of course the woman does not wish to deny the possibility of forgetting, but she believes, and not without reason, that practically the same inference of a certain unwillingness may be drawn from the unintentional forgetting as from the conscious subterfuge. Similarly, in military service no distinction is recognized between an omission resulting from forgetting and one in consequence of intentional neglect, and rightly so. The soldier dares forget nothing that military service demands of him. If he forgets in spite of this, even when he is acquainted with the demands, then it is due to the fact that the motives which urge the fulfillment of the military exactions are opposed by contrary motives. Thus, the 1 year's volunteer who at inspection pleads forgetting as an excuse for not having polished his buttons is sure to be punished. But this punishment is small in comparison to the one he courts if he admits to his superiors that the motive for his negligence is because "this miserable menial service is altogether disgusting to me." Owing to this saving of punishment for economic reasons, as it were, he makes use of forgetting as an excuse, or it comes about as a compromise. The service of women, as well as the military service of the state, demands that nothing relating to that service be subject to forgetting. Thus it suggests that forgetting is permissible in unimportant matters, but in weighty matters its occurrence is an indication that one wishes to treat weighty matters as unimportant, that is, that their importance is disputed. The viewpoint of psychic validity is in fact not to be contested here. No person forgets to carry out actions that seem important to himself without exposing himself to the suspicion of being a sufferer from mental weakness. Our investigations, therefore, can extend only to the forgetting of more or less secondary intentions, for no intention do we deem absolutely indifferent, otherwise it would certainly never have been formed. As in the preceding functional disturbances, I have collected the cases of neglect through forgetting which I have observed in myself, and endeavored to explain them. I have found that they could invariably be traced to some interference of unknown and unadmitted motives, or, as may be said, they are due to a counter will. In a number of these cases I found myself in a position similar to that of being in some distasteful service. I was under a constraint to which I had not entirely resigned myself, so that I showed my protest in the form of forgetting. This accounts for the fact that I am particularly prone to forget to send congratulations on such occasions as births, jubilees, wedding celebrations, and promotions to higher rank. I continually make new resolutions, but I am more than ever convinced that I shall not succeed. I am now on the point of giving it up altogether, and to admit consciously the striving motives. In a period of transition, I told a friend who asked me to send a congratulatory telegram for him at a certain time when I was to send one myself, that I would probably forget both. It was not surprising that the prophecy came true. It is undoubtedly due to painful experiences in life that I am unable to manifest sympathy where this manifestation must necessarily appear exaggerated, for the small amount of my feeling does not admit the corresponding expression. Since I have learned that I often mistook the pretended sympathy of others for real, I am in rebellion against the conventions of expressing sympathy, the social expediency of which I naturally acknowledge. Condolences in cases of death are accepted from this double treatment. Once I determine to send them, I do not neglect them. Where my emotional participation has nothing more to do with social duty, its expression is never inhibited by forgetting. Cases in which we forget to carry out actions which we have promised to do as a favor for others can similarly be explained as antagonism to conventional duty, and as an unfavorable inward opinion. Here it regularly proves correct, inasmuch as the only person appealed to believes in the excusing power of forgetfulness, while the one requesting the favor has no doubt about the right answer. He has no interest in this matter, otherwise he would not have forgotten it. There are some who are noted as generally forgetful, and we excuse their lapses in the same manner as we excuse those who are short-sighted when they do not greet us in the street. Such persons forget all small promises which they have made. They leave unexecuted all orders which they have received. They prove themselves unreliable in little things, and at the same time demand that we shall not take these slight offenses amiss. That is, they do not want us to attribute these failings to personal characteristics, but to refer them to an organic peculiarity. I am not one of these people myself, and have had no opportunity to analyze the actions of such a person in order to discover from the selection of forgetting the motive underlying the same. I cannot forego, however, the conjecture per anagolium that here the motive is an unusual large amount of unavowed disregard for others, which exploits the constitutional factor for its purpose. In other cases, the motives for forgetting are less easy to discover, and when found excite greater astonishment. Thus, in former years, I observed that of a great number of professional calls, I only forgot those that I was to make on patients whom I treated gratis or on colleagues. The mortification caused by this discovery led me to the habit of noting every morning the calls of the day in a form of resolution. I do not know if other physicians have come to the same practice by a similar road. Thus we get an idea of what causes the so-called neurasthenic to make a memorandum of the communications he wishes to make to the doctor. He apparently lacks confidence in the reproductive capacity of his memory. This is true, but the scene usually proceeds in this manner. The patient has recounted his various complaints and inquiries at considerable length. After he has finished, he pauses for a moment, then he pulls out the memorandum and says apologetically, "I have made some notes because I cannot remember anything." As a rule, he finds nothing new in the memorandum. He repeats each point and answers it himself. "Yes, I have already asked about that." By means of the memorandum, he probably only demonstrates one of his symptoms, the frequency with which his resolutions are disturbed through the interference of obscure motives. I am touching, moreover, on an affliction to which even most of my healthy acquaintances are subject, when I admit that, especially in former years, I had the habit of easily forgetting for a long time to return borrowed books. Also, that it very often happened that I deferred payments through forgetfulness. One morning not long ago I left the tobacco shop where I made my daily purchase of cigars without paying. It was a most harmless omission, as I am known there and could therefore expect to be reminded of my debt the next morning. But this slight neglect, the attempt to contract a debt, was surely not unconnected with reflections concerning the budget with which I had occupied myself throughout the preceding day. Even among the so-called respectable people, one can readily demonstrate a double behavior when it concerns the theme of money and possession. The primitive greed of the suckling, which wishes to seize every object in order to put it in its mouth, has generally been only imperfectly subdued through culture and training. I fear that in all the examples thus far given I have grown quite commonplace, but it can be only a pleasure to me if I happen upon familiar matters which every one understands, for my main object is to collect everyday material and utilize it scientifically. I cannot conceive why wisdom, which is, so to speak, the sediment of everyday experiences, should be denied admission among the acquisitions of knowledge, for it is not the diversity of objects, but the stricter method of verification and the striving for far-reaching connection, which make up the essential character of scientific work. We have invariably found that intentions of some importance are forgotten when obscure motives arise to disturb them. In still less important intentions we find a second mechanism of forgetting. Here a counter-will becomes transferred to the resolution from something else, after an external association has been formed between the latter and the content of the resolution. The following example, reported by Brill, illustrates this. A patient found that she had suddenly become very negligent in her correspondence. She was naturally punctual and took pleasure in letter writing, but for the last few weeks she simply could not bring herself to write a letter without exerting the greatest amount of effort. The explanation was quite simple. Some weeks before she had received an important letter calling for a categorical answer. She was undecided what to say, and therefore did not answer at all. This decision in the form of inhibition was unconsciously transferred to other letters, and caused the inhibition against letter writing in general. Direct counter-will and more remote motivation are found together in the following example of delaying. I had written a short treatise on the dream for the series Grenzfragen des Nerven und Seelenlebens, in which I gave an abstract of my book, The Interpretation of Dreams. Bergman, the publisher, had sent me the proof sheets, and asked for a speedy return of the same, as he wished to issue the pamphlet before Christmas. I corrected the sheets the same night, and placed them on my desk in order to take them to the post office the next morning. In the morning I forgot all about it, and only thought of it in the afternoon at the sight of the paper cover on my desk. In the same way I forgot the proofs that evening and the following morning, and until the afternoon of the second day, when I quickly took them to a letter box, wondering what might be the basis of this procrastination. Obviously I did not want to send them off, although I could find no explanation for such an attitude. After posting the letter, I entered the shop of my Vienna publisher, who put out my interpretation of dreams. I left a few orders, then, as if impelled by a sudden thought, said, "You undoubtedly know that I have written the dream book a second time." "Ah!" he exclaimed, "then I must ask you to—" "Calm yourself," I interposed. "It is only a short treatise for the Lohenfeld-Kurella collection." But still he was not satisfied. He feared that the abstract would hurt the sale of the book. I disagreed with him, and finally asked, "If I had come to you before, would you have objected to the publication?" "No, under no circumstances," he answered. Personally, I believe I acted within my full rights, and did nothing contrary to the general practice. Still, it seems certain to me that a thought similar to that entertained by the publisher was the motive for my procrastination in dispatching the proof sheets. This reflection leads back to a former occasion when another publisher raised some difficulties because I was obliged to take out several pages of the text from an earlier work on cerebral infantile paralysis, and put them unchanged into a work on the same theme in Nothingel's handbook. There again the reproach received no recognition. That time also I had loyally informed my first publisher, the same who published The Interpretation of Dreams, of my intention. However, if this series of recollections is followed back still farther, it brings to light a still earlier occasion relating to a translation from the French, in which I really violated the property rights that should be considered in a publication. I had added notes to the text without asking the author's permission, and some years later I had cause to think that the author was dissatisfied with this arbitrary action. There is a proverb which indicates the popular knowledge that the forgetting of intentions is not accidental. It says, "What one forgets once, he will often forget again." Indeed, we sometimes cannot help feeling that no matter what may be said about forgetting and faulty actions, the whole subject is already known to everybody as something self-evident. It is strange enough that it is still necessary to push before consciousness such well-known facts. How often I have heard people remark, "Please do not ask me to do this. I shall surely forget it." The coming true of this prophecy later is surely nothing mysterious in itself. He who speaks thus perceives the inner resolution not to carry out the request, and only hesitates to acknowledge it to himself. Much light is thrown, moreover, on the forgetting of resolutions through something which could be designated as forming false resolutions. I had once promised a young author to write a review of his short work, but on account of inner resistances not unknown to me, I promised him that it would be done the same evening. I really had serious intentions of doing so, but I had forgotten that I had set aside that evening for the preparation of an expert testimony that could not be deferred. After I thus recognized my resolution as false, I gave up the struggle against my resistances, and refused the author's request. Section 7. Chapter 8. Erroneously carried out actions. I shall give another passage from the above-mentioned work of Meringer and Meyer. "Lapses in speech do not stand entirely alone. They resemble the errors which often occur in our other activities, and are quite foolishly termed forgetfulness." I am therefore in no way the first to presume that there is a sense and purpose behind the slight functional disturbances of the daily life of healthy people. If the lapse in speech, which is without doubt a motor function, admits of such a conception, it is quite natural to transfer to the lapses of our other motor functions the same expectation. I have here formed two groups of cases, all of these cases in which the faulty effect seems to be the essential element, that is, the deviation from the intention, I denote as erroneously carried out actions. The others, in which the entire action appears rather inexpedient, I call symptomatic and chance actions. But no distinct line of demarcation can be formed. Indeed, we are forced to conclude that all divisions used in this treatise are of only descriptive significance, and contradict the inner unity of the sphere of manifestation. The psychologic understanding of erroneous actions apparently gains little in clearness when we place it under the head of ataxia, and especially under cortical ataxia. Let us rather try to trace the individual examples to their proper determinants. To do this, I shall again resort to personal observations, the opportunities for which I could not very frequently find in myself. A. In former years, when I made more calls at the homes of patients than I do at present, it often happened, when I stood before a door where I should have knocked or rung the bell, that I would pull the key of my own house from my pocket, only to replace it, quite abashed. When I investigated in what patients' homes that occurred, I had to admit that the faulty action, taking out my key instead of ringing the bell, signified paying a certain tribute to the house where the error occurred. It was equivalent to the thought, "Here I feel at home," as it happened only where I possessed the patient's regard. Naturally, I never rang my own doorbell. The faulty action was therefore a symbolic representation of a definite thought which was not accepted consciously as serious. For in reality the neurologist is well aware that the patient seeks him only so long as he expects to be benefited by him, and that his own excessively warm interest for his patient is evinced only as a means of psychic treatment. An almost identical repetition of my experience is described by A. Mader. Several lines in French follow. Jones speaks as follows about the use of keys. The use of keys is a fertile source of occurrences of this kind, of which two examples may be given. If I am disturbed in the midst of some engrossing work at home by having to go to the hospital to carry out some routine work, I am very apt to find myself trying to open the door of my laboratory there with the key of my desk at home, although the two keys are quite unlike each other. The mistake unconsciously demonstrates where I would rather be at the moment. Some years ago I was acting in a subordinate position at a certain institution, the front door of which was kept locked, so that it was necessary to ring for admission. On several occasions I found myself making serious attempts to open the door with my house key. Each one of the permanent visiting staff, of which I aspired to be a member, was provided with a key to avoid the trouble of having to wait at the door. My mistake thus expressed the desire to be on a similar footing, and to be quite at home there." A similar experience is reported by Dr. Hans Sachs of Vienna. I always carry two keys with me, one for the door of my office and one for my residence. They are not by any means easily interchanged, as the office key is at least 3 times as big as my house key. Besides, I carry the first in my trouser pocket and the other in my vest pocket. Yet it often happened that I noticed in reaching the door that while ascending the stairs I had taken out the wrong key. I decided to undertake a statistical examination, as I was daily in about the same emotional state when I stood before both doors. I thought that the interchanging of the two keys must show a regular tendency, if they were differently determined physically. Observation of later occurrences showed that I regularly took out my house key before the office door. Only on one occasion was this reversed. I came home tired, knowing that I would find there a guest. I made an attempt to unlock the door with the naturally too big office key." B. At a certain time, twice a day, for 6 years, I was accustomed to wait for admission before a door in the second story of the same house, and during this long period of time it happened twice, within a short interval, that I climbed a story higher. On the first of these occasions I was in an ambitious daydream, which allowed me to mount always higher and higher. In fact, at that time I heard the door in question open as I put my foot on the first step of the 3rd floor. On the other occasion I again went too far, engrossed in thought. As soon as I became aware of it, I turned back, and sought to snatch the dominating fantasy. I found that I was irritated over a criticism of my works, in which the reproach was made that I always went too far, which I replaced by the less respectful expression, climbed too high. C. For many years a reflex hammer and a tuning fork lay side by side on my desk. One day I hurried off at the close of my office hours, as I wished to catch a certain train, and despite broad daylight put the tuning fork in my coat pocket in place of the reflex hammer. My attention was called to the mistake through the weight of the object drawing down my pocket. Anyone accustomed to reflect on such slight occurrences would without hesitation explain the faulty action by the hurry of the moment, and excuse it. In spite of that, I preferred to ask myself why I took the tuning fork instead of the hammer. The haste could just as well have been a motive for carrying out the action properly, in order not to waste time over the correction. "Who last grasped the tuning fork?" was the question which immediately flashed through my mind. It happened that only a few days ago an idiotic child, whose attention to sensory impressions I was testing, had been so fascinated by the tuning fork that I found it difficult to tear it away from him. Could it mean, therefore, that I was an idiot? To be sure, so it would seem, as the next thought which associated itself with the hammer was chamer, Hebrew for ass. But what was the meaning of this abusive language? We must here inquire into the situation. I hurried to a consultation at a place on the Western Railroad to see a patient who, according to the anamnesis which I received by letter, had fallen from a balcony some months before, and since then had been unable to walk. The physician who invited me wrote that he was still unable to say whether he was dealing with a spinal injury or traumatic neurosis, hysteria. That was what I was to decide. This could therefore be a reason to be particularly careful in this delicate differential diagnosis. As it is, my colleagues think that hysteria is diagnosed far too carelessly where more serious matters are concerned. But the abuse is not yet justified. Yes, the next association was that the small railroad station is the same place in which, some years previous, I saw a young man who, after a certain emotional experience, could not walk properly. At that time I diagnosed his malady as hysteria, and later put him under psychic treatment. But it afterward turned out that my diagnosis was neither incorrect nor correct. A large number of the patient's symptoms were hysterical, and they promptly disappeared in the course of treatment. But back of these there was a visible remnant that could not be reached by therapy, and could be referred only to multiple sclerosis. Those who saw the patient after me had no difficulty in recognizing the organic affliction. I could scarcely have acted or judged differently. Still, the impression was that of a serious mistake. The promise of a cure which I had given him could naturally not be kept. The mistake in grasping the tuning fork instead of the hammer could therefore be translated into the following words: "You fool, you ass, get yourself together this time, and be careful not to diagnose again a case of hysteria where there is an incurable disease, as you did in this place years ago in the case of the poor man." And fortunately for this little analysis, even if unfortunately for my mood, this same man, now having a very spastic gait, had been to my office a few days before, one day after the examination of the idiotic child. We observe that this time it is the voice of self-criticism which makes itself perceptible through the mistake in grasping. The erroneously carried out action is specially suited to express self-reproach. The present mistake attempts to represent the mistake which was committed elsewhere. D. It is quite obvious that grasping the wrong thing may also serve a whole series of other obscure purposes. Here is a first example. It is very seldom that I break anything. I am not particularly dexterous, but by virtue of the anatomic integrity of my nervous and muscular apparatus, there are apparently no grounds in me for such awkward movements with undesirable results. I can recall no object in my home the counterpart of which I have ever broken. Owing to the narrowness of my study, it has often been necessary for me to work in the most uncomfortable position among my numerous antique clay and stone objects, of which I have a small collection. So much is this true that onlookers have expressed fear lest I topple down something and shatter it. But it never happened. Then why did I brush to the floor the cover of my simple inkwell so that it broke into pieces? My inkstand is made of a flat piece of marble, which is hollowed out for the reception of the glass inkwell. The inkwell has a marble cover with a knob of the same stone. A circle of bronze statuettes with small terracotta figures is set behind this inkstand. I seated myself at the desk to write. I made a remarkably awkward outward movement with the hand holding the pen holder, and so swept the cover of the inkstand, which already lay on the desk, to the floor. It is not difficult to find the explanation. Some hours before, my sister had been in the room to look at some of my new acquisitions. She found them very pretty, and then remarked, "Now the desk really looks very well, only the inkstand does not match. You must get a prettier one." I accompanied my sister out, and did not return for several hours, but then, as it seems, I performed the execution of the condemned inkstand. Did I perhaps conclude from my sister's words that she intended to present me with a prettier inkstand on the next festive occasion, and did I shatter the unsightly old one in order to force her to carry out her signified intention? If that be so, then my swinging motion was only apparently awkward. In reality it was most skilful and designed, as it understood how to avoid all the valuable objects located near it. I actually believe that we must accept this explanation for a whole series of seemingly accidental awkward movements. It is true that on the surface these seem to show something violent and irregular, similar to spastic ataxic movements. But on examination they seem to be dominated by some intention, and they accomplish their aim with a certainty that cannot be generally credited to conscious arbitrary motions. In both characteristics, the force as well as the sure aim, they show besides a resemblance to the motor manifestations of the hysterical neurosis, and in part also to the motor accomplishments of somnambulism, which here, as well as there, point to the same unfamiliar modification of the functions of innervation. In latter years, since I have been collecting such observations, it has happened several times that I have shattered and broken objects of some value, but the examination of these cases convinced me that it was never the result of accident or of my unintentional awkwardness. Thus, one morning, while in my bathrobe and straw slippers, I followed a sudden impulse as I passed a room, and hurled a slipper from my foot against the wall, so that it brought down a beautiful little marble Venus from its bracket. As it fell to pieces, I recited, quite unmoved, the following verse from Bush: Ach, die Venus ist perdu, Clicker Adams von Medici. This crazy action, and my calmness at the sight of the damage, is explained in the then existing situation. We had a very sick person in the family, of whose recovery I had personally despaired. That morning I had been informed that there was a great improvement. I know that I had said to myself, after all, she will live. My attack of destructive madness served therefore as the expression of a grateful feeling toward fate, and afforded me the opportunity of performing an act of sacrifice, just as if I had vowed, if she gets well, I will give this or that as a sacrifice. That I chose the Venus of Medici as this sacrifice was only gallant homage to the convalescent, but even today it is still incomprehensible to me that I decided so quickly, aimed so accurately, and struck no other object in close proximity. Another breaking, in which I utilized a penholder falling from my hand, also signified a sacrifice, but this time it was a pious offering to avert some evil. I had once allowed myself to reproach a true and worthy friend for no other reason than certain manifestations which I interpreted from his unconscious activity. He took it amiss, and wrote me a letter in which he bade me not to treat my friends by psychoanalysis. I had to admit that he was right, and appeased him with my answer. While writing this letter I had before me my latest acquisition, a small, handsome, glazed Egyptian figure. I broke it in the manner mentioned, and then immediately knew that I had caused this mischief to avert a greater one. Luckily, both the friendship and the figure could be so cemented that the break would not be noticed. A third case of breaking had a less serious connection. It was only a disguised execution, to use an expression from Vischer's Auch einer, of an object that no longer suited my taste. For quite a while I had carried a cane with a silver handle. Through no fault of mine, the silver plate was once damaged and poorly repaired. Soon after the cane was returned, I mirthfully used the handle to angle for the leg of one of my children. In that way it naturally broke, and I got rid of it. The indifference with which we accept the resulting damage in all these cases may certainly be taken as evidence for the existence of an unconscious purpose in their execution. E. As can sometimes be demonstrated by analysis, the dropping of objects, or the overturning and breaking of the same, are very frequently utilized as the expression of unconscious streams of thought, but more often they serve to represent the superstitious or odd significances connected therewith in popular sayings. The meanings attached to the spilling of salt, the overturning of a wine-glass, the sticking of a knife dropped to the floor, and so on, are well known. I shall discuss later the right to investigate such superstitious interpretations. Here I shall simply observe that the individual awkward acts do not by any means always have the same meaning, but, depending on the circumstances, they serve to represent now this or that purpose. Recently we passed through a period in my house during which an unusual number of glass and china dishes were broken. I myself largely contributed to this damage. This little endemic was readily explained by the fact that it preceded the public betrothal of my eldest daughter. On such festivities it is customary to break some dishes, and utter at the same time some felicitating expression. This custom may signify a sacrifice, or express any other symbolic sense. When servants destroy fragile objects through dropping them, we certainly do not think in the first place of a psychologic motive for it. Still, some obscure motives are not improbable even here. Nothing lies farther from the uneducated than the appreciation of art and works of art. Our servants are dominated by a foolish hostility against these productions, especially when the objects, whose worth they do not realize, become a source of a great deal of work for them. On the other hand, persons of the same education and origin, employed in scientific institutions, often distinguish themselves by great dexterity and reliability in the handling of delicate objects, as soon as they begin to identify themselves with their masters, and consider themselves an essential part of the staff. I shall here add the report of a young mechanical engineer, which gives some insight into the mechanism of damaging things. Quote, "Some time ago I worked with many others in the laboratory of the high school on a series of complicated experiments on the subject of elasticity. It was a work that we undertook of our own volition, but it turned out that it took up more of our time than we expected. One day, while going to the laboratory with F., he complained of losing so much time, especially on this day, when he had so many other things to do at home. I could only agree with him, and he added half jokingly, alluding to an incident in the previous week, 'Let us hope that the machine will refuse to work, so that we can interrupt the experiment and go home earlier.' In arranging the work, it happened that F. was assigned to the regulation of the pressure valve. That is, it was his duty to carefully open the valve and let the fluid under pressure flow from the accumulator into the cylinder of the hydraulic press. The leader of the experiment stood at the manometer and called a loud 'stop' when the maximum pressure was reached. At this command, F. grasped the valve and turned it with all his force to the left. All valves, without any exception, are closed to the right. This caused a sudden full pressure in the accumulator of the press, and as there was no outlet, the connecting pipe burst. This was quite a trifling accident to the machine, but enough to force us to stop our work for the day and go home. It is characteristic, moreover, that some time later, on discussing this occurrence, my friend F. could not recall the remark that I positively remember his having made." End quote. Similarly, to fall, to make a misstep, or to slip, need not always be interpreted as an entirely accidental miscarriage of a motor action. The linguistic double meaning of these expressions points to diverse hidden fantasies, which may present themselves through the giving up of bodily equilibrium. I recall a number of lighter nervous ailments in women and girls, which made their appearance after falling without injury, and which were conceived as traumatic hysteria as a result of the shock of the fall. At that time I already entertained the impression that these conditions had a different connection, that the fall was already a preparation of the neurosis, and an expression of the same unconscious fantasies of sexual content, which may be taken as the moving forces behind the symptoms. Was not this very thing meant in the proverb which says, "When a maiden falls, she falls on her back"? We can also add to these mistakes the case of one who gives a beggar a gold piece in place of a copper or a silver coin. The solution of such mishandling is simple. It is an act of sacrifice, designed to mollify fate, to avert evil, and so on. If we hear a tender mother or aunt express concern regarding the health of a child, directly before taking a walk during which she displays her charity contrary to her usual habit, we can no longer doubt the sense of this apparently undesirable accident. In this manner our faulty acts make possible the practice of all those pious and superstitious customs which must shun the light of consciousness, because of the strivings against them in our unbelieving reason. F. That accidental actions are really intentional will find no greater credence in any other sphere than in sexual activity, where the border between the intention and the accident hardly seems discernible. That an apparently clumsy movement may be utilized in a most refined way for sexual purposes, I can verify by a nice example from my own experience. In a friend's house I met a young girl visitor, who excited in me a feeling of fondness which I had long believed extinct, thus putting me in a jovial, loquacious, and complacent mood. At that time I endeavored to find out how this came about, as a year before this same girl made no impression on me. As the girl's uncle, a very old man, entered the room, we both jumped to our feet to bring him a chair which stood in the corner. She was more agile than I, and also nearer the object, so that she was the first to take possession of the chair. She carried it with its back to her, holding both hands on the edge of the seat. As I got there later and did not give up the claim to carrying the chair, I suddenly stood directly back of her, and with both my arms was embracing her from behind, and for a moment my hands touched her lap. I naturally solved the situation as quickly as it came about, nor did it occur to anybody how dexterously I had taken advantage of this awkward movement. Occasionally I have had to admit to myself that the annoying awkward stepping aside on the street, whereby for some seconds one steps here and there, yet always in the same direction as the other person, until finally both stop facing each other, that is, barring one's way, repeats in ill-mannered, provoking conduct of earlier times, and conceals erotic purposes under the mask of awkwardness. From my psychoanalysis of neurotics, I know that the so-called naivete of young people and children is frequently only such a mask, employed in order that the subject may say or do the indecent without restraint. W. Steckel has reported similar observations in regard to himself. Quote, I entered a house and offered my right hand to the hostess. In a most remarkable way I thereby loosened the bow which held together her loose morning gown. I was conscious of no dishonorable intent, still I executed this awkward movement with the agility of a juggler. End quote. G. The effects which result from mistakes of normal persons are as a rule of a most harmless nature. Just for this reason it would be particularly interesting to find out whether mistakes of considerable importance, which could be followed by serious results, as, for example, those of physicians or druggists, fall within the range of our point of view. As I am seldom in a position to deal with active medical matters, I can only report one mistake from my own experience. I treated a very old woman, whom I visited twice daily for several years. My medical activities were limited to 2 acts, which I performed during my morning visits. I dropped a few drops of an eye lotion into her eyes, and gave her a hypodermic injection of morphine. I prepared regularly 2 bottles, a blue one containing the eye lotion, and a white one containing the morphine solution. While performing these duties, my thoughts were mostly occupied with something else, for they had been repeated so often that the attention acted as if free. One morning I noticed that the automaton worked wrong. I had put the dropper into the white instead of into the blue bottle, and had dropped into the eyes the morphine instead of the lotion. I was greatly frightened, but then calmed myself through the reflection that a few drops of a 2% solution of morphine would not likely do any harm, even if left in the conjunctival sac. The cause of the fright manifestly belonged elsewhere. In attempting to analyze the slight mistake, I first thought of the phrase, "to seize the old woman by mistake," which pointed out the short way to the solution. I had been impressed by a dream which a young man had told me the previous evening, the contents of which could be explained only on the basis of sexual intercourse with his own mother. The strangeness of the fact that the Oedipus legend takes no offense at the age of Queen Jocasta seemed to me to agree with the assumption that in being in love with one's mother we never deal with the present personality, but with her youthful memory picture carried over from our childhood. Such incongruities always show themselves where one fantasy fluctuating between 2 periods is made conscious, and is then bound to one definite period. Deep in thoughts of this kind, I came to my patient of over 90. I must have been well on the way to grasp the universal character of the Oedipus fable as the correlation of the fate which the oracle pronounces, for I made a blunder in reference to or on the old woman. Here again the mistake was harmless. Of the 2 possible errors, taking the morphine solution for the eye, or the eye lotion for the injection, I chose the one by far the least harmful. The question still remains open whether in mistakes in handling things which may cause serious harm we can assume an unconscious intention, as in the cases here discussed. The following case from Brill's experience corroborates the assumption that even serious mistakes are determined by unconscious intentions. Quote, "A physician received a telegram informing him that his aged uncle was very sick. In spite of important family affairs at home, he at once repaired to that distant town, because his uncle was really his father, who had cared for him since he was 1½ years old, when his own father had died. On reaching there, he found his uncle suffering from pneumonia, and as the old man was an octogenarian, the doctors held out no hope for his recovery. It was simply a question of a day or two, was the local doctor's verdict. Although a prominent physician in a big city, he refused to cooperate in the treatment, as he found that the case was properly managed by the local doctor, and he could not suggest anything to improve matters. Since death was daily expected, he decided to remain to the end. He waited a few days, but the sick man struggled hard, and although there was no question of any recovery, because of the many new complications which had arisen, death seemed to be deferred for a while. One night, before retiring, he went into the sick room and took his uncle's pulse. As it was quite weak, he decided not to wait for the doctor, and administered a hypodermic injection. The patient grew rapidly worse and died within a few hours. There was something strange in the last symptoms, and on later attempting to replace the tube of hypodermic tablets into the case, he found to his consternation that he had taken out the wrong tube, and instead of a small dose of digitalis, he had given a large dose of hyoscine. This case was related to me by the doctor after he read my paper on the Oedipus complex. We agreed that this mistake was determined not only by his impatience to get home to his sick child, but also by an old resentment and unconscious hostility toward his uncle father." End quote. It is known that in the more serious cases of psychoneuroses, one sometimes finds self-mutilations as symptoms of the disease. That the psychic conflict may end in suicide can never be excluded in these cases. Thus I know from experience, which some day I shall support with convincing examples, that many apparently accidental injuries happening to such persons are really self-inflicted. This is brought about by the fact that there is a constantly lurking tendency to self-punishment, usually expressing itself in self-reproach, or contributing to the formation of a symptom, which skillfully makes use of an external situation. The required external situation may accidentally present itself, or the punishment tendency may assist it until the way is open for the desired injurious effect. Such occurrences are by no means rare, even in cases of moderate severity, and they betray the portion of unconscious intention through a series of special features. For example, through the striking presence of mind which the patients show in the pretended accidents. I will report exhaustively one in place of many such examples from my professional experience. A young woman broke her leg below the knee in a carriage accident, so that she was bedridden for weeks. The striking part of it was the lack of any manifestation of pain, and the calmness with which she bore her misfortune. This calamity ushered in a long and serious neurotic illness, from which she was finally cured by psychotherapy. During the treatment I discovered the circumstances surrounding the accident, as well as certain impressions which preceded it. The young woman, with her jealous husband, spent some time on the farm of her married sister, in company with her numerous other brothers and sisters, and with their wives and husbands. One evening she gave an exhibition of one of her talents before this intimate circle. She danced artistically the can-can, to the great delight of her relatives, but to the great annoyance of her husband, who afterward whispered to her, "Again you have behaved like a prostitute." The words took effect. We will leave it undecided whether it was just on account of the dance. That night she was restless in her sleep, and the next forenoon she decided to go out driving. She chose the horses herself, refusing one team and demanding another. Her youngest sister wished to have her baby with its nurse accompany her, but she opposed this vehemently. During the drive she was nervous. She reminded the coachman that the horses were getting skittish, and as the fidgety animals really produced a momentary difficulty, she jumped from the carriage in fright and broke her leg, while those remaining in the carriage were uninjured. Although after the disclosure of these details we can hardly doubt that this accident was really contrived, we cannot fail to admire the skill which forced the accident to mete out a punishment so suitable to the crime. For, as it happened, can-can dancing with her became impossible for a long time. Concerning self-inflicted injuries of my own experience, I cannot report anything in calm times, but under extraordinary conditions I do not believe myself incapable of such acts. When a member of my family complains that he or she has bitten his tongue, bruised her finger, and so on, instead of the expected sympathy, I put the question, "Why did you do that?" But I have most painfully squeezed my thumb after a youthful patient acquainted me during the treatment with his intention, naturally not to be taken seriously, of marrying my eldest daughter, while I knew that she was then in a private hospital in extreme danger of losing her life. One of my boys, whose vivacious temperament was wont to put difficulties in the management of nursing him in his illness, had a fit of anger one morning because he was ordered to remain in bed during the forenoon, and threatened to kill himself, a way out suggested to him by the newspapers. In the evening he showed me a swelling on the side of his chest, which was the result of bumping against the door-knob. To my ironical question why he did it, and what he meant by it, the 11-year-old child explained, "That was my attempt at suicide, which I threatened this morning." However, I did not believe that my views on self-inflicted wounds were accessible to my children at that time. Whoever believes in the occurrence of semi-intentional self-inflicted injury, if this awkward expression be permitted, will become prepared to accept through it the fact that aside from conscious intentional suicide, there also exists semi-intentional annihilation with unconscious intentions, which is capable of aptly utilizing a threat against life and masking it as a casual mishap. Such mechanism is by no means rare, for the tendency to self-destruction exists to a certain degree in many more persons than in those who bring it to completion. Self-inflicted injuries are, as a rule, a compromise between this impulse and the forces working against it, and even where it really comes to suicide, the inclination has existed for a long time with less strength or as an unconscious and repressed tendency. Even suicide, consciously committed, chooses its time, means, and opportunity. It is quite natural that unconscious suicide should wait for a motive to take upon itself one part of the causation, and thus free it from its oppression by taking up the defensive forces of the person. These are in no way idle discussions which I here bring up. More than one case of apparently accidental misfortune on a horse or out of a carriage has become known to me, whose surrounding circumstances justified the suspicion of suicide. For example, during an officer's horse race, one of the riders fell from his horse and was so seriously injured that a few days later he succumbed to his injuries. His behavior after regaining consciousness was remarkable in more than one way, and his conduct previous to the accident was still more remarkable. He had been greatly depressed by the death of his beloved mother, had crying spells in the society of his comrades, and to his trusted friends had spoken of the tedium vitae. He had wished to quit the service in order to take part in a war in Africa which had no interest for him. Formerly a keen rider, he had later evaded riding whenever possible. Finally, before the horse race, from which he could not withdraw, he expressed a sad foreboding, which most expectedly, in the light of our conception, came true. It may be contended that it is quite comprehensible without any further cause that a person in such a state of nervous depression cannot manage a horse as well as on normal days. I quite agree with that, only I should think to look for the mechanism of this motor inhibition through nervousness in the intention of self-destruction here emphasized. Dr. Ferenczi has left to me for publication the analysis of an apparently accidental injury by shooting, which he explained as an unconscious attempt at suicide. I can only agree with his deduction. Quote, J.A., 22 years old, carpenter, visited me on the 18th of January, 1908. He wished to know whether the bullet which pierced his left temple, March 20th, 1907, could or should be removed by operation. Aside from occasional, not very severe headaches, he felt quite well. Also, the objective examination showed nothing besides the characteristic powder wound on the left temple, so that I advised against an operation. When questioned concerning the circumstances of the case, he asserted that he injured himself accidentally. He was playing with his brother's revolver, and believing that it was not loaded, he pressed it with his left hand against the left temple (he is not left-handed), put his finger on the trigger, and the shot went off. There were 3 bullets in the 6-shooter. I asked him how he came to carry the revolver, and he answered that it was at the time of his army conscription, that he took it to the inn the evening before because he feared fights. At the army examination he was considered unfit for service on account of varicose veins, which caused him much mortification. He went home and played with the revolver. He had no intention of hurting himself, but the accident occurred. On further questioning whether he was otherwise satisfied with his fortune, he answered with a sigh, and related a love affair with a girl who loved him in return, but nevertheless left him. She emigrated to America out of sheer avariciousness. He wanted to follow her, but his parents prevented him. His lady love left on the 20th of January, 1907, just 2 months before the accident. Despite all these suspicious elements, the patient insisted that the shot was an accident. I was firmly convinced, however, that the neglect to find out whether the revolver was loaded before he began to play with it, as well as the self-inflicted wound, were physically determined. He was still under the depressing effects of the unhappy love affair, and apparently wanted to forget everything in the army. When this hope, too, was taken away from him, he resorted to playing with the weapon, that is, to an unconscious attempt at suicide. The fact that he did not hold the revolver in the right, but in the left hand, speaks conclusively in favor of the fact that he was really only playing, that is, he did not wish consciously to commit suicide." End quote. Another analysis of an apparently accidental self-inflicted wound, detailed to me by an observer, recalls the saying, "He who digs a pit for others falls in himself." Quote, Mrs. X, belonging to a good middle-class family, is married and has 3 children. She is somewhat nervous, but never needed any strenuous treatment, as she could sufficiently adapt herself to life. One day she sustained a rather striking, though transitory, disfigurement of her face in the following manner. She stumbled in a street that was in process of repair, and struck her face against the house wall. The whole face was bruised, the eyelids blue and edematous, and as she feared that something might happen to her eyes, she sent for the doctor. After she was calmed, I asked her, "But why did you fall in such a manner?" She answered that just before the accident she warned her husband, who had been suffering for some months from a joint affliction, to be very careful in the street, and she often had the experience that in some remarkable way those things occurred to her against which she warned others. I was not satisfied with this as the determination of her accident, and asked her whether she had not something else to tell me. Yes, just before the accident she noticed a nice picture in a shop on the other side of the street, which she suddenly desired as an ornament for her nursery, and wished to buy it at once. She thereupon walked across to the shop without looking at the street, stumbled over a heap of stones, and fell with her face against the wall, without making the slightest effort to shield herself with her hands. The intention to buy the picture was immediately forgotten, and she walked home in haste. "But why were you not more careful?" I asked. "Oh," she said, "perhaps it was only a punishment for that episode which I confided to you. Has this episode still bothered you?" "Yes, later I regretted it very much, I considered myself wicked, criminal, and immoral, but at the time I was almost crazy with nervousness. She referred to an abortion, which was started by a quack, and had to be brought to completion by a gynecologist. This abortion was initiated with the consent of her husband, as both wished, on account of their pecuniary circumstances, to be spared from being additionally blessed with children. She said I had often reproached myself with the words, "You really had your child killed," and I feared that such a crime would not remain unpunished. Now that you have assured me that there is nothing seriously wrong with my eyes, I am quite assured I have already been sufficiently punished. This accident, therefore, was on the one hand a retribution for her sin, but on the other hand it may have served as an escape from a more dire punishment, which she had feared for many months. In the moment that she ran to the shop to buy the picture, the memory of this whole history, with its fears, already quite active in her unconscious at the time she warned her husband, became overwhelming, and could perhaps find expression in words like these: "But why do you want an ornament for the nursery, you who had your child killed? You are a murderer. The great punishment is surely approaching." This thought did not become conscious, but instead of it she made use of the situation, I might say of the psychologic moment, to utilize in a commonplace manner the heap of stones to inflict upon herself this punishment. It was for this reason that she did not even attempt to put out her arms while falling, and was not much frightened. The second, and probably lesser determinant of her accident, was obviously the self-punishment for her unconscious wish to be rid of her husband, who was an accessory to the crime in this affair. This was betrayed by her absolutely superfluous warning to be very careful in the street on account of the stones, for just because her husband had a weak leg, he was very careful in walking." If such a rage against one's own integrity in one's own life can be hidden behind apparently accidental awkwardness and motor insufficiency, then it is not a big step forward to grasp the possibility of transferring the same conception to mistakes which seriously endanger the life and health of others. What I can put forward as evidence for the validity of this conception was taken from my experience with neurotics, and hence does not fully meet the demands of this situation. I will report a case in which it was not an erroneously carried out act, but what may be more aptly termed a symbolic or chance action, that gave me the clue which later made possible the solution of the patient's conflict. I once undertook to improve the marriage relations of a very intelligent man, whose differences with his tenderly attached young wife could surely be traced to real causes, but he himself admitted could not be altogether explained through them. He continually occupied himself with the thought of a separation, which he repeatedly rejected, because he dearly loved his 2 small children. In spite of this, he always returned to that resolution, and sought no means to make the situation bearable to himself. Such an unsettlement of a conflict served to prove to me that there were unconscious and repressed motives, which enforced the conflicting conscious thoughts, and in such cases I always undertake to end the conflict by psychic analysis. One day the man related to me a slight occurrence which had extremely frightened him. He was sporting with the older child, by far his favorite. He tossed it high in the air, and repeated this tossing, till finally he thrust it so high that its head almost struck the massive gas chandelier. Almost, but not quite, or say just about. Nothing happened to the child, except that it became dizzy from fright. The father stood transfixed with the child in his arms, while the mother merged into an hysterical attack. The particular facility of this careless movement, with the violent reaction in the parents, suggested to me to look upon this accident as a symbolic action, which gave expression to an evil intention toward the beloved child. I could remove the contradiction of the actual tenderness of this father for his child by referring the impulse to injure it to the time when it was only one, and so small that as yet the father had no occasion for tender interest in it. Then it was easy to assume that this man, so little pleased with his wife at that time, might have thought, if this small being, for whom I have no regard whatever, should die, I would be free and could separate from my wife. The wish for the death of this much loved being must therefore have continued unconsciously. From here it was easy to find the way to the unconscious fixation of this wish. There was indeed a powerful determinant in a memory from the patient's childhood. It referred to the death of a little brother, which the mother laid to his father's negligence, and which led to serious quarrels with threats of separation between the parents. The continued course of my patient's life, as well as the therapeutic success, confirmed my analysis. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Symptomatic and Chance Actions. The actions described so far, in which we recognize the execution of an unconscious intention, appeared as disturbances of other unintended actions, and hid themselves under the pretext of awkwardness. Chance actions, which we shall now discuss, differ from erroneously carried out actions only in that they disdain the support of a conscious intention, and really need no pretext. They appear independently, and are accepted because one does not credit them with any aim or purpose. We execute them without thinking anything of them, by mere chance, just to keep the hands busy, and we feel confident that such information will be quite sufficient should one inquire as to their significance. In order to enjoy the advantage of this exceptional position, these actions, which no longer claim awkwardness as an excuse, must fulfill certain conditions. They must not be striking, and their effects must be insignificant. I have collected a large number of such chance actions from myself and others, and after thoroughly investigating the individual examples, I believe that the name symptomatic actions is more suitable. They give expression to something which the actor himself does not suspect in them, and which, as a rule, he has no intention of imparting to others, but aims to keep to himself. Like the other phenomena considered so far, they thus play the part of symptoms. The richest output of such chance or symptomatic actions is above all obtained in the psychoanalytic treatment of neurotics. I cannot deny myself the pleasure of showing by two examples of this nature how far and how delicately the determination of these plain occurrences are swayed by unconscious thoughts. The line of demarcation between the symptomatic actions and the erroneously carried out actions is so indefinite that I could have disposed of these examples in the preceding chapter. A. During the analysis, a young woman reproduced this idea, which suddenly occurred to her. Yesterday, while cutting her nails, she had cut into the flesh while engaged in trimming the cuticle. This is of so little interest that we ask in astonishment why it is at all remembered and mentioned, and therefore come to the conclusion that we deal with a symptomatic action. It was really the finger upon which the wedding ring is worn, which was injured through this slight awkwardness. It happened, moreover, on her wedding day, which thus gives to the injury of the delicate skin a very definite and easily guessed meaning. At the same time she also related a dream, which alluded to the awkwardness of her husband and her anesthesia as a woman. But why did she injure the ring finger of her left hand, when the wedding ring is worn on the right? Her husband is a jurist, a doctor of laws, docteur de recht, literally a doctor of rights, and her secret affection as a girl belonged to a physician who was jokingly called Doctor de Link, literally doctor of left. Incidentally, a left-handed marriage has a definite meaning. B. A single young woman relates, yesterday, quite unintentionally, I tore $100 note in two pieces, and gave half to a woman who was visiting me. Is that, too, a symptomatic action? After close investigation, the matter of the $100 note elicited the following associations. She dedicated a part of her time and her fortune to charitable work. Together with another woman, she was taking care of the rearing of an orphan. The $100 was the contribution sent her by that woman, which she enclosed in an envelope and provisionally deposited on her writing desk. The visitor was a prominent woman with whom she was associated in another act of charity. This woman wished to note the names of a number of persons to whom she could apply for charitable aid. There was no paper, so my patient grasped the envelope from her desk, and without thinking of its contents, tore it in two pieces, one of which she kept in order to have a duplicate list of names, and gave the other to her visitor. Note the harmlessness of this aimless occurrence. It is known that $100 note suffers no loss in value when it is torn, provided all the pieces are produced. That the woman would not throw away the piece of paper was assumed by the importance of the names on it, and there was just as little doubt that she would return the valuable content as soon as she noticed it. But to what unconscious thought should this chance action, which was made possible through forgetfulness, give expression? The visitor in this case had a very definite relation to my patient and myself. It was she who at one time had recommended me as physician to the suffering girl, and if I am not mistaken, my patient considered herself indebted for this advice. Should this halved $100 note perhaps represent a fee for her mediation? That still remained enigmatic. But other material was added to this beginning. Several days before, a woman mediator of a different sort had inquired of a relative whether the gracious young lady wished to make the acquaintance of a certain gentleman, and that morning, some hours before the woman's visit, the wooing letter of the suitor arrived, giving occasion for much mirth. When therefore the visitor opened the conversation with inquiries regarding the health of my patient, the latter could well have thought, "You certainly found me the right doctor, but if you could assist me in obtaining the right husband and a child, I should be still more grateful." Both mediators became fused into one in this repressed thought, and she handed the visitor the fee which her fantasy was ready to give the other. This resolution became perfectly convincing when I add that I had told her of such chance or symptomatic actions only the previous evening. She then took advantage of the next occasion to produce an analogous action. We can undertake a grouping of these extremely frequent chance and symptomatic actions, according to their occurrence, as habitual, regular under certain circumstances, and as isolated ones. The first group, such as playing with the watch chain, fingering one's beard, and so on, which can almost serve as a characteristic of the person concerned, is related to the numerous tic movements, and certainly deserves to be dealt with in connection with the latter. In the second group I place the playing with one's cane, the scribbling with one's pencil, the jingling of coins in one's pocket, kneading dough and other plastic materials, all sorts of handling of one's clothing, and many other actions of the same order. These playful occupations during psychic treatment regularly conceal sense and meaning to which other expression is denied. Generally, the person in question knows nothing about it. He is unaware whether he is doing the same thing, or whether he has imitated certain modifications in his customary playing, and he also fails to see or hear the effects of these actions. For example, he does not hear the noise which is produced by the jingling of coins, and he is astonished and incredulous when his attention is called to it. Of equal significance to the physician, and worthy of his observation, is everything that one does with his clothing, often without noticing it. Every change in the customary attire, every little negligence, such as an unfastened button, every trace of exposure, means to express something that the wearer of the apparel does not wish to say directly. Usually he is entirely unconscious of it. The interpretation of these trifling chance actions, as well as the proof for their interpretation, can be demonstrated every time with sufficient certainty from the surrounding circumstances during the treatment, from the themes under discussion, and from the ideas that come to the surface when attention is directed to the seeming accident. Because of this connection, I will refrain from supporting my assertions by reporting examples with their analyses, but I mention these matters because I believe that they have the same meaning in normal persons as in my patients. I cannot, however, refrain from showing by at least one example how closely an habitually accomplished symbolic action may be connected with the most intimate and important part of the life of a normal individual. Quote, as Professor Freud has taught us, the symbolism in the infantile life of the normal plays a greater role than was expected from earlier psychoanalytic experiences. In view of this, the following brief analysis may be of general interest, especially on account of its medical aspects. A doctor, on rearranging his furniture in a new house, came across a straight wooden stethoscope, and after pausing to decide where he should put it, was impelled to place it on the side of his writing desk in such a position that it stood exactly between his chair and the one reserved for his patients. The act in itself was certainly odd, for in the first place the straight stethoscope served no purpose, as he invariably used a binaural one. And in the second place, all his medical apparatus and instruments were always kept in drawers, with the sole exception of this one. However, he gave no thought to the matter until one day it was brought to his notice by a patient who had never seen a wooden stethoscope, asking him what it was. On being told, she asked why he kept it there. He answered in an offhand way that that place was as good as any other. This, however, started him thinking, and he wondered whether there had been an unconscious motive in his action. Being interested in the psychoanalytic method, he asked me to investigate the matter. The first memory that occurred to him was the fact that when a medical student he had been struck by the habit his hospital intern had of always carrying in his hand a wooden stethoscope on his ward visits, although he never used it. He greatly admired this intern and was much attached to him. Later on, when he himself became an intern, he contracted the same habit, and would feel very uncomfortable if by mistake he left the room without having the instrument to swing in his hand. The aimlessness of the habit was shown not only by the fact that the only stethoscope he ever used was a binaural one which he carried in his pocket, but also in that it was continued when he was a surgical intern and never needed any stethoscope at all. From this it is evident that the idea of the instrument in question had in some way or other become invested with a greater psychic significance than normally belongs to it. In other words, that to the subject it stood for more than it does for other people. The idea must have got unconsciously associated with some other one which it symbolized, and from which it derived its additional fullness of meaning. I will forestall the rest of the analysis by saying what this secondary idea was, namely a phallic one. The way in which this curious association had been formed will presently be related. The discomfort he experienced in hospital on missing the instrument, and the relief and assurance the presence of it gave him, was related to what is known as a castration complex, namely a childhood fear, often continued in a disguised form into adult life, lest a private part of his body should be taken away from him, just as playthings so often were. The fear was due to paternal threats that it would be cut off if he were not a good boy, particularly in a certain direction. This is a very common complex, and accounts for a great deal of general nervousness and lack of confidence in later years. Then came a number of childhood memories relating to his family doctor. He had been strongly attached to this doctor as a child, and during the analysis long-buried memories were recovered of a double fantasy he had in his 4th year concerning the birth of a younger sister, namely that she was the child, 1, of himself and his mother, the father being relegated to the background, and 2, of the doctor and himself. In this he thus played both a masculine and feminine part. At the time when his curiosity was being aroused by the event, he could not help noticing the prominent share taken by the doctor in the proceedings, and the subordinate position occupied by the father. The significance of this for his later life will presently be pointed out. The stethoscope association was formed through many connections. In the first place, the physical appearance of the instrument, a straight, rigid, hollow tube, having a small bulbous summit at one extremity and a broad base at the other, and the fact of its being the essential part of the medical paraphernalia, the instrument with which the doctor performed his magical and interesting feats, were matters that attracted his boyish attention. He had had his chest repeatedly examined by the doctor at the age of 6, and distinctly recollected the voluptuous sensation of feeling the latter's head near him, pressing the wood stethoscope into his chest, and the rhythmic to and fro respiratory movement. He had been struck by the doctor's habit of carrying his stethoscope inside his hat. He found it interesting that the doctor should carry this chief instrument concealed about his person, always handy when he went to see patients, and that he only had to take off his hat, that is, a part of his clothing, and pull it out. At the age of 8, he was impressed by being told by an older boy that it was the doctor's custom to get into bed with his women patients. It is certain that the doctor, who was young and handsome, was extremely popular among the women of the neighborhood, including the subject's own mother. The doctor and his instrument were therefore the objects of great interest throughout his boyhood. It is probable that, as in many other cases, unconscious identification with the family doctor had been a main motive in determining the subject's choice of profession. It was here doubly conditioned, 1. By the superiority of the doctor on certain interesting occasions to the father, of whom the subject was very jealous, and 2. By the doctor's knowledge of forbidden topics, and his opportunity for illicit indulgence. The subject admitted that he had on several occasions experienced erotic temptations in regard to his women patients. He had twice fallen in love with one, and finally married one. The next memory was of a dream, plainly of a homosexual masochistic nature. In it a man, who proved to be a replacement figure of the family doctor, attacked the subject with a sword. The idea of a sword, as is so frequently the case in dreams, represented the same idea that was mentioned above to be associated with that of a wooden stethoscope. The thought of a sword reminded the subject of the passage in the Niebling saga where Sigurd sleeps with his naked sword, Gram, between him and Brunhilde, an incident that had always greatly struck his imagination. The meaning of the symptomatic act now at last became clear. The subject had placed his wooden stethoscope between him and his patient, just as Sigurd had placed his sword, an equivalent symbol, between him and the maiden he was not to touch. The act was a compromise formation. It served both to gratify in his imagination the repressed wish to enter into nearer relations with an attractive patient, interposition of phallus, and at the same time to remind him that this wish was not to become a reality, interposition of sword. It was, so to speak, a charm against yielding to temptation. I might add that the following passage from Lord Lytton's Richelieu made a great impression on the boy. Beneath the rule of men entirely great, the pen is mightier than the sword, and that he became a prolific writer and uses an unusually large fountain pen. When I asked him what need he had of this pen, he replied in a characteristic manner, "I have so much to express." This analysis again reminds us of the profound views that are afforded us in the psychic life through the harmless and senseless actions, and how early in life the tendency to symbolization develops. End quote. I can also relate an experience from my psychotherapeutic practice in which the hand, playing with a mass of breadcrumbs, gave evidence of an eloquent declaration. My patient was a boy not yet 13 years of age, who had been very hysterical for 2 years. I finally took him for psychoanalytic treatment, after a lengthy stay at a hypertherapeutic institution had proved futile. My supposition was that he must have had sexual experiences, and that corresponding to his age he had been troubled by sexual questions, but I was cautious about helping him with explanations as I wished to test further my assumption. I was therefore curious as to the manner in which the desired material would evince itself in him. One day it struck me that he was rolling something between the fingers of his right hand. He would thrust it into his pocket, and there continue playing with it, then would draw it out again, and so on. I did not ask what he had in his hand, but as he suddenly opened his hand he showed it to me. It was breadcrumbs kneaded into a mass. At the next session he again brought along a mass, and in the course of our conversation, although his eyes were closed, modeled a figure with an incredible rapidity which excited my interest. Without doubt it was a mannequin like the crudest prehistoric idols, with a head, two arms, two legs, and an appendage between the legs which he drew out to a long point. This was scarcely completed when he kneaded the mannequin together again. Later he allowed it to remain, but modeled an identical appendage in the flat of the back and on other parts, in order to veil the meaning of the first. I wished to show him that I had understood him, but at the same time I wanted to deprive him of the evasion that he had thought of nothing while actively forming these figures. With this intention I suddenly asked him whether he remembered the story of a Roman king who gave his son's envoy a pantomimic answer in his garden. The boy did not wish to recall what he must have learned so much more recently than I. He asked if that was the story of the slave on whose bald skull the answer was written. I told him no, that belonged to Greek history, and related the following. King Tarquinius Superbus had induced his son Sextus to steal into a Latin city. The son, who had later obtained a foothold in the city, sent a messenger to the king asking what steps he should take next. The king gave no answer, but went into his garden, had the question repeated there, and silently struck off the heads of the largest and most beautiful poppies. All that the messenger could do was to report this to Sextus, who understood his father, and caused the most distinguished citizens of the city to be removed by assassination. While I was speaking, the boy stopped kneading, and as I was relating what the king did in his garden, I noticed that at the words silently struck, he tore off the head of the mannequin with a movement as quick as lightning. He therefore understood me, and showed that he was also understood by me. Now I could question him directly, and gave him the information that he desired, and in a short time the neurosis came to an end. The symptomatic actions which we observe in inexhaustible abundance in healthy as well as in nervous people are worthy of our interest for more than one reason. To the physician they often serve as valuable indications for orienting himself in new or unfamiliar conditions. To the keen observer they often betray everything, occasionally even more than he cares to know. He who is familiar with its application sometimes feels like King Solomon, who, according to the Oriental legend, understood the language of animals. One day I was to examine a strange young man at his mother's home. As he came towards me, I was attracted by a large stain on his trousers, which by its peculiar stiff edges I recognized as one produced by albumen. After a moment's embarrassment, the young man excused this stain by remarking that he was hoarse and therefore drank a raw egg, and that some of the slippery white of the egg had probably fallen on his clothes. To confirm his statement, he showed the eggshell, which could still be seen on a small plate in the room. The suspicious spot was thus explained in this harmless way, but as his mother left us alone, I thanked him for having so greatly facilitated the diagnosis for me, and without further procedure I took as the topic of our discussion his confession that he was suffering from the effects of masturbation. Another time I called on a woman as rich as she was miserly and foolish, who was in the habit of giving the physician the task of working his way through a heap of her complaints before he could reach the simple cause of her condition. As I entered, she was sitting at a small table, engaged in arranging silver dollars in little piles. As she rose, she tumbled some of the pieces of money to the floor. I helped her pick them up, but interrupted the recitation of her misery by remarking, "Has your good son-in-law been spending so much of your money again?" She bitterly denied this, only to relate a few moments later the lamentable story of the aggravation caused by her son-in-law's extravagances. And she has not sent for me since. I cannot maintain that one always makes friends of those to whom he tells the meaning of their symptomatic actions. He who observes his fellow men while at table will be able to verify in them the nicest and most instructive symptomatic actions. Dr. Hans Sachs relates the following, quote, "I happened to be present when an elderly couple related to me partook of their supper. The lady had stomach trouble and was forced to follow a strict diet. A roast was put before the husband, and he requested his wife, who was not allowed to partake of this food, to give him the mustard. The wife opened the closet and took out the small bottle of stomach drops and placed it on the table before her husband. Between the barrel-shaped mustard glass and the small drop bottle there was naturally no similarity through which the mishandling could be explained, yet the wife only noticed the mistake after her husband laughingly called her attention to it. The sense of this symptomatic action needs no explanation." End quote. For an excellent example of this kind, which was very skillfully utilized by the observer, I am indebted to Dr. Baron Dattner of Vienna. Quote, "I dined in a restaurant with my colleague H., a doctor of philosophy. He spoke about the injustice done to probationary students, and added that even before he finished his studies he was placed as secretary to the ambassador, or rather the extraordinary plenipotentiary minister to Chile. But, he added, the minister was afterwards transferred, and I did not make an effort to meet the newly appointed." While uttering the last sentence he was lifting a piece of pie to his mouth, but he let it drop as if out of awkwardness. I immediately grasped the hidden sense of this symptomatic action, and remarked to my colleague, who was unacquainted with psychoanalysis, "You really allowed a very choice morsel to slip from you." He did not realize, however, that my words could equally refer to his symptomatic action, and he repeated the same words I uttered with a peculiarly agreeable and surprising vividness, as if I had actually taken the words from his mouth. It was really a very choice morsel that I allowed to get away from me. He then followed this remark with a detailed description of his clumsiness, which has cost him this very remunerative position. The sense of this symbolic action becomes clearer if we remember that my colleague had scruples about telling me, almost a perfect stranger, concerning his precarious material situation, and his repressed thought took on the mask of symptomatic action, which expressed symbolically what was meant to be concealed, and the speaker thus got relief from his unconscious. End quote. That the taking away or taking along things without any apparent intention may prove to be senseful may be shown by the following examples. 1. Dr. B. Dattner relates, quote, "An acquaintance paid the first after-marriage visit to a highly regarded lady friend of his youth. He told me of this visit and expressed his surprise at the fact that he failed in his resolution to visit with her only a short time, and then reported to me a rather strange faulty act which happened to him there. The husband of this friend, who took part in the conversation, was looking for a box of matches which he was sure was on the table when he came there. My acquaintance, too, looked through his pockets to ascertain whether he had not put it in his pocket, but without avail. Some time later he actually found it in his pocket, and was struck by the fact that there was only one match in the box. A dream a few days later, showing the box symbolism in reference to the friend of his youth, confirmed my explanation. With the symptomatic action, my acquaintance meant to announce his priority right and the exclusiveness of his position. It contained only one match." End quote. Dr. Hans Sachs relates the following, quote, "Our cook is very fond of a certain kind of pie. There is no possible doubt about this, as it is the only kind of pastry which she always prepares well. One Sunday she brought this pie to the table, took it off the pie plate, and proceeded to remove the dishes used in the former course. But on the top of this pile she placed the pie, and disappeared with it into the kitchen. We first thought that she had something to improve on the pie, but as she failed to appear, my wife rang the bell and asked Betty what happened to the pie, to which the girl answered, without comprehending the question, "How's that?" We had to call her attention to the fact that she carried the pie back to the kitchen. She had put it on a pile of dishes, taken it out, and put it away, without noticing it. The next day, when we were about to consume the rest of the pie, my wife noticed that there was as much of it as we had left the day before. That is, the girl had disdained to eat the portion of her favorite dish, which was rightly hers. Questioned why she did not eat the pie, she answered, somewhat embarrassed, that she did not care for it. The infantile attitude is distinctly noticeable on both occasions. First, the childish insatiableness in refusing to share with anybody the object of her wishes. Then the reaction of spite, which is just as childish. "If you grudge it to me, keep it to yourself. I want nothing of it." End quote. Chance or symptomatic actions occurring in affairs of married life have often a most serious significance, and could lead those who do not concern themselves with the psychology of the unconscious to a belief in omens. It is not an auspicious beginning if a young woman loses her wedding ring on her wedding tour, even if it were only mislaid and soon found. I know a woman, now divorced, who in the management of her business affairs frequently signed her maiden name many years before she actually resumed it. Once I was the guest of a newly married couple, and heard the young woman laughingly relate her latest experience, how on the day succeeding her return from the wedding tour she had sought out her single sister in order to go shopping with her as in former times, while her husband was attending business. Suddenly she noticed a man on the opposite side of the street. Nudging her sister, she said, "Why, that is surely Mr. L." She forgot that for some weeks this man had been her husband. I was chilled at this tale, but I did not dare draw any inferences. The little story came back to me only several years later, after this marriage had ended most unhappily. The following observation, which could as well have found a place among the examples of forgetting, was taken from a noteworthy work published in French by A. Mater. Statement in French follows. A friend who has learned to observe signs related to me that the great actress Eleonora Duse introduces a symptomatic action into one of her roles, which shows very nicely from what depth she draws her acting. It is a drama dealing with adultery. She has just been discussing with her husband, and now stands soliloquizing before the seducer makes his appearance. During this short interval she plays with her wedding ring. She pulls it off, replaces it, and finally takes it off again. She is now ready for the other. I know of an elderly man who married a young girl, and instead of starting at once on his wedding tour, he decided to spend the night in a hotel. Scarcely had they reached the hotel when he noticed with fright that he was without his wallet, in which he had the entire sum of money for the wedding tour. He must have mislaid or lost it. He was still able to reach his servant by telephone. The latter found the missing article in the coat discarded for the traveling clothes, and brought it to the hotel to the waiting bridegroom, who had thus entered upon his marriage without means. It is consoling to think that the losing of objects by people is merely an unsuspected extension of a symptomatic action, and is thus welcome, at least to the secret intention of the loser. Often it is only an expression of slight appreciation of the lost article, a secret dislike for the same, or perhaps for the person from whom it came, or the desire to lose this object was transferred to it from other and more important objects through symbolic association. The loss of valuable articles serves as an expression of diverse feelings. It may either symbolically represent a repressed thought, that is, it may bring back a memory which one would rather not hear, or it may represent a sacrifice to the obscure forces of fate, the worship of which is not yet entirely extinct even with us. The following examples will illustrate these statements concerning the losing of objects. Dr. B. Datner states, "A colleague related to me that he lost his steel pencil, which he had had for over 2 years, and which, on account of its superior quality, was highly prized by him. Analysis elicited the following facts. The day before he had received a very disagreeable letter from his brother-in-law, the concluding sentence of which read, 'At present I have neither the desire nor the time to assist you in your carelessness and laziness.' The effect connected with this letter was so powerful that the next day he promptly sacrificed the pencil, which was a present from his brother-in-law, in order not to be burdened with his favors." Brill reports the following example. "A doctor took exception to the following statement in my book: 'We never lose what we really want.' His wife, who is very interested in psychologic subjects, read with him the chapter on Psychopathology of Everyday Life. They were both very much impressed with the novelty of the ideas, and so on, and were very willing to accept most of the statements. He could not, however, agree with the above given statement, because, as he said to his wife, 'I surely did not wish to lose my knife.' He referred to a valuable knife given to him by his wife, which he highly prized, the loss of which caused him much pain. It did not take his wife very long to discover the solution for this loss in a manner to convince them both of the accuracy of my statement. When she presented him with this knife, he was a bit loath to accept it. Although he considered himself quite emancipated, he nevertheless entertained some superstition about giving or accepting a knife as a gift, because it is said that a knife cuts friendship. He even remarked this to his wife, who only laughed at his superstition. He had the knife for years before it disappeared. Analysis brought out the fact that the disappearance of the knife was directly connected with a period when there were violent quarrels between himself and his wife, which threatened to end in separation. They lived happily together until his stepdaughter, it was his second marriage, came to live with them. His daughter was the cause of many misunderstandings, and it was at the height of these quarrels that he lost the knife. The unconscious activity is very nicely shown in this symptomatic action. In spite of his apparent freedom from superstition, he still unconsciously believed that a donated knife may cut friendship between the persons concerned. The losing of it was simply an unconscious defense against losing his wife, and by sacrificing the knife he made the superstitious ban impotent." In a lengthy discussion with the aid of dream analysis, Otto Rank made clear the sacrificial tendency with its deep-reaching motivation. It must be said that just such symptomatic actions often give us access to the understanding of the intimate psychic life of the person. Of the many isolated chance actions, I will relate one example which showed a deeper meaning even without analysis. This example clearly explains the conditions under which such symptoms may be produced most casually, and also shows that an observation of practical importance may be attached to it. During a summer tour, it happened that I had to wait several days at a certain place for the arrival of my traveling companions. In the meantime I made the acquaintance of a young man who also seemed lonely, and was quite willing to join me. As we lived at the same hotel, it was quite natural that we should take all our meals and our walks together. On the afternoon of the third day he suddenly informed me that he expected his wife to arrive on that evening's express train. My psychologic interest was now aroused, as it had struck me that morning that my companion rejected my proposal to make a long excursion, and in our short walk he objected to a certain path as too steep and dangerous. During our afternoon walk he suddenly thought that I must be hungry, and insisted that I should not delay my evening meal on his account, that he would not sup before his wife's arrival. I understood the hint, and seated myself at the table while he went to the station. The next morning we met in the foyer of the hotel. He presented me to his wife, and added, "Of course you will breakfast with us?" I had to attend first to a small matter in the next street, but assured him that I would return shortly. Just as I entered the breakfast room, I noticed that the couple were at a small table near the window, both seated on the same side of it. On the opposite side there was only one chair, which was covered, however, by a man's large and heavy coat. I understood well the meaning of this unintentional, none the less expressive disposition of the coat. It meant this: there is no room for you here, you are superfluous now. The man did not notice that I remained standing before the table, being unable to take the seat, but his wife noticed it, and quickly nudged her husband and whispered, "Well, you have covered the gentleman's place with your coat." These, as well as other similar experiences, have caused me to think that the actions executed unintentionally must inevitably become the source of misunderstanding in human relations. The perpetrator of the act, who is unaware of any associated intention, takes no account of it, and does not hold himself responsible for it. On the other hand, the second party, having regularly utilized even such acts as those of his partner to draw conclusions as to their purpose and meaning, recognizes more of the stranger's psychic processes than the latter is ready either to admit or believe that he has imparted. He becomes indignant when these conclusions drawn from his symptomatic actions are held up to him. He declares them baseless, because he does not see any conscious intention in their execution, and complains of being misunderstood by the other. Close examination shows that such misunderstandings are based on the fact that the person is too fine an observer and understands too much. The more nervous two persons are, the more readily they will give each other cause for disputes, which are based on the fact that one as definitely denies about his own person what he is sure to accept about the other. And this is indeed the punishment for the inner dishonesty to which people grant expression under the guise of forgetting, of erroneous actions and accidental emotions, a feeling which they would do better to confess to themselves and others when they can no longer control it. As a matter of fact, it can be generally affirmed that every one is continually practicing psychoanalysis on his neighbors, and consequently learns to know them better than each individual knows himself. The road following the admonition, "Know thyself," leads through the study of one's own apparently casual commissions and omissions. The end of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Errors. Errors of memory are distinguished from forgetting and false recollections through one feature only, namely, that the error, false recollection, is not recognized as such, but finds credence. However, the use of the expression error seems to depend on still another condition. We speak of erring instead of falsely recollecting, where the character of the objective reality is emphasized in the psychic material to be reproduced, that is, where something other than a fact of my own psychic life is to be remembered, or rather something that may be confirmed or refuted through the memory of others. The reverse of the error in memory in this sense is formed by ignorance. In my book, The Interpretation of Dreams, I was responsible for a series of errors in historical and above all in material facts, which I was astonished to discover after the appearance of the book. On closer examination, I found that they did not originate from my ignorance, but could be traced to errors of memory explainable by means of analysis. A. On page 361 I indicated as Schiller's birthplace the city of Marburg, a name which recurs in Styria. The error is found in the analysis of a dream during a night journey from which I was awakened by the conductor calling out the name of the station Marburg. In the contents of the dream, inquiry is made concerning a book by Schiller, but Schiller was not born in the university town of Marburg, but in the Swabian city of Marbach. I maintain I always knew this. B. On page 165, Hannibal's father is called Hasdrubal. This error was particularly annoying to me, but it is most corroborative of my conception of such errors. Few readers of the book are better posted on the history of the Barkides than the author who wrote this error and overlooked it in 3 proofs. The name of Hannibal's father was Hamilcar Barcus. Hasdrubal was the name of Hannibal's brother, as well as that of his brother-in-law and predecessor in command. C. On pages 217 and 492, I assert that Zeus emasculates his father Cronos and hurls him from the throne. This horror I have erroneously advanced by a generation. According to Greek mythology, it was Cronos who committed this on his father Uranus. How is it to be explained that my memory furnished me with false material on these points, while it usually places the most remote and unusual materials at my disposal, as the readers of my books can verify? And what is more, in 3 carefully executed proofreadings, I passed over these errors as if struck blind. Goethe said to Lichtenberg, "Where he cracks a joke, there lies a concealed problem." Similarly, we can affirm of these passages cited from my book, back of every error is a repression. More accurately stated, the error conceals a falsehood, a disfigurement which is ultimately based on repressed material. In the analysis of the dreams there reported, I was compelled by the very nature of the theme to which the dream thoughts related, on the one hand, to break off the analysis in some places before it had reached its completion, and on the other hand, to remove an indiscreet detail through a slight disfigurement of its outline. I could not act differently, and had no other choice, if I was at all to offer examples and illustrations. My constrained position was necessarily brought about by the peculiarity of dreams, which give expression to repressed thoughts, or to material which is incapable of being conscious. In spite of this, it is said that enough material remained to offend the most sensitive souls. The disfigurement or concealment of the continuing thoughts known to me could not be accomplished without leaving some trace. What I wish to repress has often, against my will, obtruded itself on what I have taken up, and evinced itself in the matter as an unnoticeable error. Indeed, each of the 3 examples given is based on the same theme. The errors are the results of repressed thoughts which occupy themselves with my deceased father. Ad A. Whoever reads through the dream analyzed on page 361 will find some parts unveiled. In some parts he will be able to divine through allusions that I have broken off the thoughts which would have contained an unfavorable criticism of my father. In the continuation of this line of thoughts and memories there lies an annoying tale, in which books and a business friend of my father, named Marburg, play a part. It is the same name, the calling out of which in the Southern Railway Station had aroused me from sleep. I wished to suppress this Mr. Marburg in the analysis, from myself and my readers. He avenged himself by intruding where he did not belong, and changed the name of Schiller's birthplace from Marbach to Marburg. Ad B. The error Hasdrubal in place of Hamilcar, the name of the brother instead of that of the father, originated from an association which dealt with the Hannibal fantasies of my college years, and my dissatisfaction with the conduct of my father toward the enemies of our people. I could have continued and recounted how my attitude toward my father was changed by a visit to England, where I made the acquaintance of my half-brother by a previous marriage of my father. My brother's oldest son was my age exactly. Thus the age relations were no hindrance to a fantasy which may be stated thus: how much pleasanter it would be had I been born the son of my brother instead of the son of my father. This suppressed fantasy then falsified the text of my book at the point where I broke off the analysis, by forcing me to put the name of the brother for that of the father. Ad C. The influence of the memory of this same brother is responsible for my having advanced by a generation the mythological horror of the Greek deities. One of the admonitions of my brother has lingered long in my memory. "Do not forget one thing concerning your conduct in life," he said. "You belong not to the 2nd, but really to the 3rd generation of your father." Our father had remarried at an advanced age, and was therefore an old man to his children by the 2nd marriage. I commit the error mentioned where I discuss the piety between parents and children. Several times friends and patients have called my attention to the fact that in reporting their dreams or alluding to them in dream analyses, I have related inaccurately the circumstances experienced by us in common. These are also historic errors. In re-examining such individual cases, I have found that my recollection of the facts was unreliable only where I had purposely disfigured or concealed something in the analysis. Here again we have an unobserved error as a substitute for an intentional concealment or repression. From these errors, which originate from repression, we must sharply distinguish those which are based on actual ignorance. Thus, for example, it was ignorance when on my excursion to Wachau I believed that I had passed the resting place of the revolutionary leader Fischoff. Only the name is common to both places. Fischoff's Emmersdorf is located in Carntham, but I did not know any better. Here is another embarrassing but instructive error, an example of temporary ignorance, if you like. One day a patient reminded me to give him the 2 books on Venice which I had promised him, as he wished to use them in planning his Easter tour. I answered that I had them ready, and went into the library to fetch them, though the truth of the matter was that I had forgotten to look them up, since I did not quite approve of my patient's journey, looking upon it as an unnecessary interruption to the treatment, and as a material loss to the physician. Thereupon I made a quick survey of the library for the books. One was Venedig Ost Kunststätte, and besides this I imagined I had an historic work of a similar order. Certainly there was De Medicare, the Medicis. I took them and brought them in to him. Then, embarrassed, I confessed my error. Of course I really knew that the Medicis had nothing to do with Venice, but for a short time it did not appear to me at all incorrect. Now I was compelled to practice justice. As I had so frequently interpreted my patient's symptomatic actions, I could save my prestige only by being honest and admitting to him the secret motives of my averseness to his trip. It may cause general astonishment to learn how much stronger is the impulse to tell the truth than is usually supposed. Perhaps it is a result of my occupation with psychoanalysis that I can scarcely lie any more. As often as I attempt a distortion, I succumb to an error or some other faulty act which betrays my dishonesty, as was manifest in this and in the preceding examples. Of all faulty actions, the mechanism of the error seems to be the most superficial. That is, the occurrence of the error invariably indicates that the mental activity concerned had to struggle with some disturbing influence, although the nature of the error need not be determined by the quality of the disturbing idea, which may have remained obscure. It is not out of place to add that the same state of affairs may be assumed in many simple cases of lapses in speaking and writing. Every time we commit a lapse in speaking or writing, we may conclude that through mental processes there has come a disturbance which is beyond our intention. It may be conceded, however, that lapses in speaking and writing often follow the laws of similarity and convenience, or the tendency to acceleration, without allowing the disturbing element to leave a trace of its own character in the error resulting from the lapses in speaking or writing. It is the responsiveness of the linguistic material which at first makes possible the determination of the error, but it also limits the same. In order not to confine myself exclusively to personal errors, I will relate a few examples which could just as well have been ranged under lapses in speech or under erroneously carried out actions, but as all these forms of faulty action have the same value, they may as well be reported here. A. I forbade a patient to speak on the telephone to his lady-love, with whom he himself was willing to break off all relations, as each conversation only renewed the struggling against it. He was to write her his final decision, although there were some difficulties in the way of delivering the letter to her. He visited me at 1 o'clock to tell me that he had found a way of avoiding these difficulties, and among other things he asked me whether he might refer to me in my professional capacity. At 2 o'clock, while he was engaged in composing the letter of refusal, he interrupted himself suddenly and said to his mother, "Well, I have forgotten to ask the Professor whether I may use his name in the letter." He hurried to the telephone, got the connection, and asked the question, "May I speak to the professor after his dinner?" In answer he got an astonished, "Adolf, have you gone crazy?" The answering voice was the very voice which at my command he had listened to for the last time. He had simply made a mistake, and in place of the physician's number had called up that of his beloved. B. During a summer vacation, a school teacher, a poor but excellent young man, courted the daughter of a summer resident, until the girl fell passionately in love with him, and even prevailed upon her family to countenance the matrimonial alliance in spite of the difference in position and race. One day, however, the teacher wrote his brother a letter in which he said, "Pretty the lass is not at all, but she is very amiable, and so far so good. But whether I can make up my mind to marry a Jewess I cannot yet tell." This letter got into the hands of the fiancé, who put an end to the engagement, while at the same time his brother was wondering at the protestations of love directed to him. My informer assured me that this was really an error and not a cunning trick. I am familiar with another case in which a woman who was dissatisfied with her old physician, and still did not openly wish to discharge him, accomplished this purpose through the interchange of letters. Here at least I can assert confidently that it was an error, and not conscious cunning, that made use of this familiar comedy motive. C. Brill tells of a woman who, inquiring about a mutual friend, erroneously called her by her maiden name. Her attention having been directed to this error, she had to admit that she disliked her friend's husband, and had never been satisfied with her marriage. Mater relates a good example of how a reluctantly repressed wish can be satisfied by means of an error. A colleague wanted to enjoy his day of leave of absence absolutely undisturbed, but he also felt that he ought to go to Lucerne to pay a call which he did not anticipate with any pleasure. After long reflection, however, he concluded to go. For pastime on the train he read the daily newspapers. He journeyed from Zurich to Arth-Goldau, where he changed trains for Lucerne, all the time engrossed in reading. Presently the conductor informed him that he was on the wrong train; that is, he had got into the one which was returning from Goldau to Zurich, whereas his ticket was for Lucerne. A very similar trick was played by me quite recently. I had promised my oldest brother to pay him a long due visit at a seashore in England. As the time was short, I felt obliged to travel by the shortest route, and without interruption. I begged for a day's sojourn in Holland, but he thought I could stop there on my return home. Accordingly, I journeyed from Munich through Cologne to Rotterdam, Hook of Holland, where I was to take the steamer at midnight to Harwich. In Cologne I had to change cars. I left my train to go into the Rotterdam express, but it was not to be found. I asked various railway employees, was sent from one platform to another, got into an exaggerated state of despair, and could easily reckon that during this fruitless search I had probably missed my connection. After this was corroborated, I pondered whether or not I should spend the night in Cologne. This was favored by a feeling of piety, for according to an old family tradition, my ancestors were once expelled from this city during a persecution of the Jews. But eventually I came to another decision. I took a later train to Rotterdam, where I arrived late at night, and was thus compelled to spend a day in Holland. This brought me the fulfillment of a long fostered wish, the sight of the beautiful Rembrandt paintings at The Hague and in the Royal Museum at Amsterdam. Not before the next forenoon, while collecting my impressions during the railway journey in England, did I definitely remember that only a few steps from the place where I got off at the railroad station in Cologne, indeed on the same platform, I had seen a large sign, Rotterdam, Hook of Holland. There stood the train in which I should have continued my journey. If one does not wish to assume that, contrary to my brother's orders, I had really resolved to admire the Rembrandt pictures on my way to him, then the fact that despite clear directions I hurried away and looked for another train must be designated as an incomprehensible blinding. Everything else, my well-acted perplexity, the emergence of the pious intention to spend the night in Cologne, was only a contrivance to hide my resolution until it had been fully accomplished. One may possibly be disinclined to consider the class of errors which I have here explained as very numerous or particularly significant; but I leave it to your consideration whether there is no ground for extending the same points of view also to the more important errors of judgment, as evinced by people in life and science. Only for the most select and most balanced minds does it seem possible to guard the perceived picture of external reality against the distortion to which it is otherwise subjected in its transit through the psychic individuality of the one perceiving it. End of chapter 10.